Hello, and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I am one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brendan Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 108th episode of the Nauticast titled Judgment Day, Part 1, an analysis of A Clash of Kings CATELYN IV, in which Catelyn Stark faces down the gods and emerges with a clarion call for peace in our time. And then has to deal with that fucking King Terrorist Renly Baratheon making fun of her. I can't, Emmett, why did we split this episode up so we have to watch Renly die next week? Can you explain this to me?
Impatience is a virtue, my son, but having committed my life to vice, I understand your frustration.
Oh.
Sadly, we'll have to wait until next week for the actual death of Renly itself. We're splitting this chapter up again, so we're going to cover Catelyn's scene in the Sept and her last conversation with Renly, where he rejects her plea for a great council. And then next week, we're going to cover Renly's death itself, along with the aftermath, which might seem like not much territory for next week, but trust me, we're going to have plenty of things to say. It's a really dense couple of scenes where a lot happens in a couple pages. Again, this is just as dense a chapter as CATELYN IV. It's not just because we love the Baratheon brother stuff, although we do. This is really some of George's thickest work, thick with two C's work. And, we're going to need 2 weeks just to go into it properly.
You're absolutely right. This chapter is outstanding in ways that CATELYN III is and expands upon CATELYN III. So I hope you guys are going to enjoy this one for sure. So, as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Mark N, Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Sir Keith J, Master of Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet, the Other Red Woman, and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Micah, Ward of the West, the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, Lord Jake Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zena Valyria, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, Ward of the East, and Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of High Garden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Anonymous, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, the Priest of the Drowned God, the King's Cook, Noli Oli, Master of Cannoli, Sir Sorsadelica, Prince Matthew of House Targaryen, Proud Soy Boy of Summerhall, Defender of the Fifth Book, and Swing Dance with Dragons, Sir K.W. Dent, Elsie the Blackwood Guard, and Batman of the Seven Kingdoms, Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Gentlems, Lord Quint Esquire, Master of Absolutely Positively Not Serving as a Spy for several unnamed high lords and ladies in order to further the secret Blackfire-style conspiracy to overthrow the oppressive small council. Haldivar, the waiter for T-Wow, A.A. Ron, Damp-haired prophet of the Forsaken and High Priest of Euron Crozai, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Vidaris of House Colgarian, the first of her name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mistress of Art, the Overworked, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser in the first draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee, the Great Game of Thrones, Portraitess of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Blender Paints, and Maker of Drawings, Shamba the Slayer, Lord Adam T, Lady Alexandra of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logas, Bloody Scorpion of the Red Field, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse-Face Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Sir Vayor, Chief of the Parties of the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, and our newest member of the small council. Everyone say hello to Lady Ashley, who joined this evening just about an hour before we recorded and hasn't given us a special title and name yet. All the same, thank you and welcome to the small council, Ashley.
Thank you as always to all our counselors and welcome Lady Ashley. Happy to have you with us.
And as always, our spoiler warning, as we say in all episodes, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Doug novellas, histories, interviews, the Winds of Winter sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from the High Bearded Priest, a small council member who asks, Your Graces, we love the character, and it would be worth it just to see the look on Mace and Littlefinger's faces, but do you think Stannis would be a good king? Excellent question from the High Bearded Priest. The answer is no. What do you think, Jeff?
The answer is a qualified no. Okay, we answered that one, so we can move
Wonderful
on, right?
work, nuanced, compelling, and rich.
No, I think your reason why Stannis is not a good king is the same reason that I think that Stannis would not be a good king, and that he's not worthy of the crown at this point in the story. In the Clash of Kings, anyways. Does he become worthy of the crown when he goes north? Well, a qualified no still. I mean, more so, but less, but still, like, he doesn't quite meet the threshold, in my opinion. But I get it, like, at a level, like, is he the best claimant for the Iron Throne after the death of all of these different kings? I mean, he's the only one left besides Tommen, right? Oh, Euron's there. You can choose Euron or Tommen or Stannis or
I'll take
Jon
Euron,
eventually.
sure.
Yeah, I know you would. I know you'd take Euron.
No, look, I think Stannis has policies and attitudes that put him way above a lot of members of his class, and a lot of the hope there gathers together around Davos. Stannis is perfectly capable of ignoring and sending away Davos when he wants to. He proved that over and over again. No matter how he listens to Davos in a lot of heartwarming moments, there are also plenty of moments where Davos goes, "Your Grace, here's obviously the right thing to do," and Stannis goes, "Meh." So why wouldn't that happen when Stannis gets, everything he ever wanted? I think for me, like one of the most haunting and terrifying Stannis moments comes in Storm of Swords when Melisandre's trying to get him to burn Edric Storm to wake the Stone Dragon. And he says, "Dragon wings over Westeros. There would be such a..." And Davos cuts him off before he can complete what he was about to say. But you kind of know what he was about to say, and it's nothing good. So it's as much as there are aspects about Stannis that I really do obviously respond to and think are intriguing and even admirable, I think those would ultimately be like, the first couple paragraphs of his legacy before it all goes up in literal smoke. So I find him, a fascinating, relatable, tragic character. I would rather have him in charge than Renly, but on the whole, no, there are too many worrying signs there.
I think our friend and our godfather, our real father, Stephen Atwell, said it best. I think we were talking one time several years ago, and he said, "Stannis as a king of Westeros, probably not a good time. As a wartime consigliere, yeah, like he's like the guy you want to be leading like the armies in a battle type setting. But as an actual political actor and leading the country, probably not the person you necessarily want to have to lead. You want somebody that's more like Rob, more like
Rob is
John,
the
more
best
like
of the kings.
Bran, yeah. So these are the types of people that should be leading. Stannis at this point is not ready for that responsibility, even though he desperately wants it to satiate his lack of love that he's received his entire life, and that's sad. And
which is what makes him relatable, absolutely. But you were talking about him so effectively in terms of the Stranger stuff the other week, is like, being the clearinghouse, like, agent for the North, just getting a lot of the folks who got to be removed from power out of the way. And similarly, Stannis is useful in an Hour of the Wolf kind of way. Stannis is useful in terms of let's pull up all the roots in King's Landing at once, and then if he was convinced to leave, then that would be great. Like, that's your ideal use of Stannis. Send him in to put heads on spikes that need to be on spikes, and then usher him quietly out the back door.
Exactly.
That's your absolute ideal use of Stannis. One time only.
Exactly. Yeah, he's like a nuclear weapon, right? Oh, we don't have to have the debate now.
I cannot be retroactively made to co-sign that one. Beautifully done. Like a Temple of Doom, heart pulled out. Anywho. I was just like recovering for a second. Thank you so much, High Bearded Priest, for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions that we'll answer here in the Notacast podcast, you're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or high-level patron over at patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF, where you can also get 25 bonus A Song of Ice and Fire episodes, 6 Fever Dream episodes, show notes, access to our exclusive Slack, and more. We're closing in on the next stretch goal of attaining 900 total patrons. And when we hit that goal, we will do a total, full-out, multi-part analysis of my personal favorite chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire, even though it hasn't been officially published, The Forsaken. If that or other Patreon benefits interest you, consider heading on over to patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF to join our Patreon for as little as $1 a month.
Mm-hmm. And as of this recording, so just so you guys are like aware of how we're reaching our goal, we are just 18 patrons short of actually hitting that goal. Listen, it was 42 patrons last month, and now it's 18. You guys are incredible and crazy. Thank you so much for supporting us. But NFL patron for now, which you can of course check out at https. I'm kidding. Patreon.com/NotacastASOF. Let's turn our attention back to Catelyn Stark. Last week, our good mom, Catelyn, had witnessed 2 children squabbling over who would play with the toy they both won. That is the Iron Throne. Let's find out what happens with Catelyn next in this synopsis of A Clash of Kings, Catelyn IV, Part 1. Catelyn arrives at the village sept after sunset to pray. She wonders if the village had a name, but there's no one around to ask because everyone is gone. She enters the sept and finds a decrepit-looking building with 7 cracked walls, and where richer cities and towns had ornate statues, this sept only had charcoal drawings of the gods. Catelyn studied their faces. The father was bearded as ever. The mother smiled, loving and protective. The warrior had his sword sketched in between his face. The smith, his hammer. The maid was beautiful. The crone wizened and wise, and the seventh face. The stranger was neither male nor female, yet both ever the outcast, the wanderer from far places, less and more than human, unknown and unknowable. Here, the face was a black oval, a shadow with stars for eyes. It made Catelyn uneasy. She would get scant comfort here. Catelyn kneels before the mother and asks that she, that is the mother, spare all the sons that are about to go to battle. And as we're going to find out in part 2 of this analysis of A Clash of Kings, CATELYN IV, the mother has a refined sense of irony. So she also asked the mother to watch over her sons too. And oh boy, about that. Catelyn notices that the wall has a crack down the charcoal etching of the mother, and it looks like a tear to Catelyn. She hears Wendell Mannerly and Robo Royce talking outside, but everything else is quiet. The gods, most of all, they're silent. She wonders if Ned ever heard the old gods talking to him, and yeah, about that. Flickering torchlight danced across the walls, making the faces seem half alive, twisting them, changing them. The statues in the great septs of the cities wore faces that the stonemasons had given them, but these charcoal scratchings were so crude they might have been anyone. The father's face made her think of her own father, dying in his bed at River Run. The warrior was Renly and Stannis, Robb and Robert, Jaime Lannister and Jon Snow. She even glimpsed Arya in those lines just for an instant. Then a gust of wind through the door made the torch sputter and the semblance was gone, washed away in orange glare. I mean, gosh, that's just so lovely. I mean, I really am seeing why you love these Catelyn chapters in Clash of Kings. Emmett, this is just really, really good. But then the smoke is in her eyes and she rubs them with the backs of her scarred hands. When she opens her eyes again, she sees her mom, Lady Minissa Tully. And we get, I think, some of the only references to Lady Minissa in all of the narrative of A Song of Ice and Fire. She was calm, had soft hands, and a warm smile. And she died in childbirth. Hello, Dead Ladies Club. Her child died with her. Catelyn wonders what Minissa would make of her, and she thinks her mom would think little of her, especially given that she's away from her children now and wasn't even there when Ned died. Oh, Catelyn, it's not your fault, man. It's okay, Mom. It's okay. Catelyn's head starts swimming and the shadows shift around her. She thinks she should have eaten something today, but she had been too busy. Well, no, not too busy. The truth was that food had lost its savor in a world without Ned. When they took his head off, they killed me too. Lovely, aching melancholy. It's really, really good. But then the torch spits and Catelyn sees a mother, Lysa. But then the eyes weren't Lysa's. They were Cersei's. She thinks that whatever vile crimes Cersei committed, those kids were hers. And she felt them kicking and bore them in blood and pain. But if they were truly Jaime's, well, she wonders if Cersei prayed to the mother, which, fact check, she does once in A Dance with Dragons. She fake prays to the mother to pretend at piety in front of the High Sparrow. Catelyn thinks that Robert would have killed Joffrey and Cersei if he found out what Cersei had done, and few would have condemned Robert for it. Oh, sure, bastards were common in Westeros, but incest was a monstrous crime and sin. The Targs did it, but they had dragons. They didn't answer to gods or men, like, because they're Targaryens. Ned must have known, and Lord Aaron before him. Small wonder that the queen had killed them both. Would I do any less for my own? Catelyn clenched her hands, feeling the tightness in her scarred fingers, where the assassin's steel had cut to the bone as she fought to save her son. Bran knows too, she whispered, lowering her head. Gods be good. He must have seen something, heard something, and that was why they tried to kill him in his bed. Catelyn gives herself over to the gods, praying to the smith to watch over Bran, the maid to give courage to Arya and Sansa and guard their innocence, the father for justice and strength and wisdom, the warrior to keep Robb safe and strong, and the crone to show Catelyn wisdom. But then footsteps are behind her. It's Sir Robo Royce, and he says they need to get going before the dawn comes. Weary, Catelyn rides from the sept in the village through woodlands where trees lean away from the sea. Then they ride through Renly's camp to the sounds of steel and the whinnying of horses. Banners are all around Catelyn, but she can't make them out in the darkness. A gray army, Catelyn thought. Gray men on gray horses beneath gray banners. As they sat their horses waiting, Renly's Shadow Knights pointed their lances upwards so she rode through a forest of tall, naked trees, bereft of leaves and life. Where Storm's End stood was only a deeper darkness, a wall of black through which no stars could shine. But she could see torches moving across the fields where Lord Stannis made his camp. Inside Renly's tent, Catelyn finds candles glowing, making the tent feel like a magical castle, quote, alive with emerald light, which is so fucking good. 2 rainbow guards stand outside of the tent with their rainbow cloaks draped over their shoulders. They allow Catelyn in, and she finds Brienne armoring Renly for the battle, with Lord Mathis Rowan and Lord Randall Tarley and Lord Randall Smallpeen Tarley standing around him. Catelyn demands to speak with Renly, but he brushes her off as Brienne fastens a backplate to breastplate. The king orders Mathis to continue, and Mathis talks about how the army is drawn up and ready for battle. But why are we attacking at dawn again? Because according to Renly, he doesn't want to have said it was he had won through treachery. That would be completely unchivalrous. He is not about that type of treachery. That is way beneath his dignity. But Randyll Tarly points out that this time was picked by Stannis, and they'd be charging against the rising sun and be half blind. But Renly waves him off, saying that Loras will break him with the charge. But what if Stannis yields? Randyll asks. Yields? Lord Rowan laughed. When Maester laid siege to Storm's End, Stannis ate rats rather than open his gates. Then Renly starts to get cute. He tells the story of Storm's End's master at arms, Sir Gawain Wild, and how at Storm's End he tried to sneak out of the castle with 3 knights, but he was stopped. And then Stannis ordered the man strapped to a catapult and thrown over the walls. Lord Rowan appeared puzzled. No men were hurled from the walls. I would surely remember that.
Maester Cresson told Stannis that we might be forced to eat our dead, and there was no gain in flinging away good meat. Renly pushed back his hair. Brienne bound it with a velvet tie and pulled a padded cap down over his ears to cushion the weight of his helm. Thanks to the Onion Knight, we were never reduced to dining on corpses, but it was a close thing. Too close for Sir Gawain, who died in his cell.
Now, mea culpa, when I originally was writing the synopsis, I originally wrote, what George is communicating here is that Renly is a fucking liar. God, why do people like this guy? But a fair reading of this scene is that Stannis orders Sir Gawain strapped to a catapult, but Maester Cresson convinces Stannis at the last minute not to toss Gawain over the walls, or Gawain, whatever you want to call him, because they might need someone to eat. Of course, Renly may have been lying and was hoping that Randyll and Mathis saw the meeting with his ellipsis, but that's not in the text, so mea culpa, Renly. You're still a monster, but at least you might not have lied in this one particular spot. Anyways, Catelyn cuts in and says that Renly promised her a word. So Renly agrees and waves everyone off to their battle tasks and drills. But if they find Sir Barristan on the battlefield, spare his life. Rowan objects that Barristan hasn't been seen recently, and Renly knows this. Barristan needs a king to serve, and if he's not at Robb's camp, he's very definitely in Stannis' camp. Man, that is such a cell phone, Renly. But Rowan and Tarly agree, bow, and leave. Now alone with Renly and Brienne, Catelyn says that the Lannisters tried to kill her son Bran. She had always wondered why, but now she thinks that he caught Cersei and Jaime in the act when Robert was out hunting at Winterfell. So she wants to go to Stannis and tell him what she suspects. Renly asks her why, and Catelyn says that Robb will put aside her crown. She hopes. And that Stannis, Robb, and Renly could call a great council, have Bran come down from Winterfell and reveal the Lannisters for their treasons and treachery. And then the great lords of Westeros will choose the next king. All will be saved.
Renly laughed. Tell me, my lady, do direwolves vote on who should lead the pack? Brienne brought the king's gauntlets and great helm, crowned with golden antlers that would add 1.5 feet to his height. The time for talk is done. Now we see who is stronger. Renly pulled a lobstered green and gold gauntlet over his left hand, while Brienne knelt to buckle on his belt, heavy with the weight of longsword and dagger.
And that is A Clash of Kings Catelyn. And that is A Clash of Kings Catelyn 4, Part 1. Boy, am I really glad we ended up splitting Catelyn 4 into 2 parts like we did with Catelyn 3, because, man, there is a ton to unpack in the whole of this chapter. I love all of it. I love this part of it. I love the second part of it. I love it all. And it's so good that we are doing this kind of like broken up so we can focus on some of these aspects of the chapter, which might get overshadowed by things to come in the second half of this episode, or the second analysis of this chapter.
Well done, sir. And yeah, much as I sang the praises of Catelyn 3 for the last 2 weeks, I think I love Catelyn 4 even more. The 2 chapters are perfect complements, of course, fitting together into a perfect whole, just as Stannis and Renly are refusing to fit together into a perfect whole. I wonder if that might be a deliberate move on George's part. Form meets content. The showdown of 2 matched opposite characters takes shape as 2 matched opposite chapters. Catelyn 3 was all about politics, dialogue, family dynamics, and a tone of comic absurdity and frustration. Catelyn 4 is all about magic, spirituality, imagery, inner monologue, and a tone of tragic sorrow and loss. Just as Stannis and Renly have a lot in common under their surface differences, these chapters have a lot in common still. Catelyn 3 showed off Lightbringer in all its blazing magical colors, and Catelyn 4 has some very important political dialogue. But I think these chapters are meant to stand out as iconic in their own unique ways, just like the Baratheon brothers. Catelyn 4 is not only a perfect follow-up and counterpoint to Catelyn 3, it is a spectacular work of art in its own regard. Every image feels sculpted in light as if by a cinematographer. Every paragraph has a turn of phrase that burns its way into your memory. This is as good as it gets.
Yeah, I Completely agree with that. This chapter and the imagery that George uses is just spectacular. And if Catelyn 3 was that last glimmer at the chance for peace, and that would being the last chance for the Baratheon brothers to quell the storm and put their swords aside, it all ended when Stannis drew Lightbringer and then sheathed it, declaring that we would see what was meant to be seen come the dawn. And that dawn has now come, but instead of it bringing newfound light, the possibility for the sun to shine, Catelyn spends this chapter shrouded in pre-dawn gloom with shadows very, very deliberately inserted by George throughout the early part of this chapter all around her. This is the short night, and it calls, I think what George is doing in a kind of meta sense is he's calling readers to think of the long night that's going to be coming after this short night, the night of the soul that Catelyn Stark is about to experience.
That's a terrific point. I'm going to be talking more next week about how Renly's death has echoes of so many things, like the Red Wedding, for example, and also the fall of the Long Night. And that it's so true in this chapter. This first half of the chapter, you see shadows popping up all over the place. Catelyn sees them like scurrying along the walls like mice, because George is trying to link the two scenes of this chapter together by setting up the shadows before a very murderous shadow shows up in the second half of the chapter. But before CATELYN IV grows to encompass the death of kings, it starts on the simplest note imaginable. One soul alone in the dark, reaching out for the light. Catelyn has mourned and fasted and is prepared to give herself to her gods. Night has fallen. There's no one else in the village. They fled, taking their families and their treasures and even the candles they lit for their gods with them. Now, why did the people in this village run? They're in the Stormlands. They're not under threat from the Lannister goons currently burning down the Riverlands. They ran because King Stannis showed up with his army. Or because they heard King Renly was on the way with his. We'll never know which, and it doesn't really matter, because they're already gone. The damage is done. And that's a perfect microcosm for what's happening between the Baratheon brothers and across the realm they both claim to rule. Just like how their ancestor Duran Godsgrief exposed his people to the elements to sate his pride, Renly and Stannis will salt the earth around their family home with their drive to get at each other, producing nothing with their industry but Lannister victory at book's end. The lines of responsibility between them blur. The act of murder itself is shrouded in ambiguity, both in execution, so to speak, in this chapter, and how it's discussed later on. But I think one takeaway should be clear. Both Baratheons bear responsibility for what happens here. They chased each other down the drain to rock bottom. Stannis' jaws happened to close a second quicker. Renly is just as ready to kill him, and that itself is the tragedy. Brother killing brother. Who cares which one wins? Who cares which one strikes first? Either way, the kingdom loses. Either way, the idea of family, one pack to survive the winter, loses. Even the winner loses. Stannis looks like a corpse after this. There are no winners, only losers. Something is rotten in the state of Westeros, and the solutions seem to be canceling each other out and leaving the problem untouched. Individuals and institutions alike seem cursed with a profound moral darkness, a blindness infecting good as well as bad. Too much light can blind the eyes.
I love that quote from Salvador San from Davos 1. It just really is utilized really well in this chapter by George. And I agree. Like, ultimately here, obviously we back Stannis' claim legally, so to speak, but it's really not so much who has the legal right at this point, right? About which king is casting the better shadow at the wall, really. Now it's just purely primal. Stannis and Renly are just about to drown each other in blood, as Catelyn thinks in CATELYN III. And as Renly's going to say at the end of this first part of this episode, the time for talk is over. Now we see who is stronger. Now, we do get all of this from Renly's perspective, which is interesting, and that does shade this traitor in an unflattering lens. But can this conversation be any different across the field in the torchlit camp of King Stannis? I don't think so at all. I mean, though, of course, Stannis is technically asleep at this point in the story, as he can't be roused, as Davos is going to later hear from his son in Davos' second chapter. And of course, as I was saying before, George uses the absence and presence of light throughout this chapter to illuminate its absence as Catelyn enters her dark night of the soul. Like you and Salvador San were saying, Emmett, too much light can blind the eyes and blind the soul.
And from this mess, an act of blood magic and kinslaying is born to shake Westeros. When the walls close in, when the floor gives way, when the truth is found to be lies and all the joy within you dies, you gotta get right with God, or gods in this case. Catelyn Stark walks alone into this darkness at the start of the chapter, without a candle, without a guide, a stranger in a strange land, as she was when she arrived in Winterfell. Only this time she doesn't even have Robb in her arms. She's bereft of her children, heartsick and guilty, especially after failing to make peace between Stannis and Renly. And that changes what her gods mean to her. When she was an innocent at Riverrun, the Seven were smiling faces, watching and waiting, just as she watched and waited for Hoster. All was well in the world. At Winterfell, domain of the old gods, the world of Catelyn's adulthood, the Seven became carved masks. This reflects how she has come of age. Gods are no longer simple caricatures just meant to reassure you. They are aspects of identity, archetypes representing all humanity, masks that you must wear. Catelyn has to deal with a world of deceit, murder, war, grief, but also a world of love, family, home, her squalling infant son grown into a man. The Seven faces are one. Light and dark, ice and fire, Stannis and Renly. These things you think are opposites, they are one in God's eyes. The God's eye, you could say. You are the sum total of every mask you wear, every light and dark element within you. You are mother and father and warrior and smith and maiden and crone and stranger. A good act does not wash out the bad, nor a bad act the good. We must reconcile them. Truth is produced through a dialectical process, not thesis nor antithesis, but what results from the combination of the two. R plus L equals J, in short. There's that all-important quote from the big R plus L equals J chapter, the Night of the Laughing Tree chapter in A Storm of Swords, from Bran's POV, when Mira is talking as they're climbing up and down the mountains. My lord father told me about mountains, but I never saw one till now. I love them more than I can say. Bran made a face at her. But you just said you hated them. Why can't it be both? Mira reached up to pinch his nose. Because they're different, he insisted, like night and day, or ice and fire. If ice can burn, said Jojen in his solemn voice, then love and hate can mate. Mountain or marsh, it makes no matter. The land is one. The land is one. That's an optimistic statement. But the flip side, as Mira says, is that the whole, the one, is over-wrinkled. Wrinkled like someone getting older. Because none of it saves you from mortality. Heroes die. Villains die. Some die for reasons born wholly of their decision-making. Others are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others suffer a combination of both. If all is one, well, then the death of one is the death of all. Davos will make precisely this argument the next time Stannis is deciding the fate of a blood relative, Edric Storm in A Storm of Swords. What is one bastard boy against a kingdom? Everything. Ned Stark's blood gushed over the sept of Baelor. Where were Catelyn's gods then? Where were his gods, she wonders. Neither of them saved him. So now all she has is rough chalk drawings, the faint gestures of gods. In part, this reflects the class realities of Westeros. Only in the rich septs of the cities are there statues of the Seven. Only for Lady Tully did someone bother to put out masks. But it also reflects Catelyn's very particular spiritual place at this time, as well as the spiritual place of Westeros. The gods are looking pretty fragile. Thousands are praying, crying out for delivery from the war. Those prayers go unanswered. So we see the Seven as crude sketches on a wall. This is all they are. This is all they ever were. The gods are stories we tell to make children behave. And when you grow up, when you leave Riverrun and head north to bury your children in the Valley of the Shadow of Death, you put childish things like those smiling gods aside.
That's really well said. And as the token spiritual co-host of the Notcast podcast, I'm kidding. Excellent reference to the Apostle Paul there. I really appreciate that, putting away childish things from 1 Corinthians. And I love the statues to mask to charcoal etchings that Catelyn is noting in her spiritual journey, which you're going to back here in just a few minutes. Catelyn is showing the maturation of faith from early childhood wonder to the adult mom going to church variety to the crisis of faith now as she approaches middle age. Catelyn is showing the maturation of faith from early childhood wonder to the, Catelyn doesn't want to be in a crisis of faith here, but from my own experience, sometimes it takes a spiritual crisis to grow in faith and as a person. To Catelyn's great credit, she doesn't give herself over to fear or become nihilistic, at least at this point anyhow. She fasts, and she holds vigil overnight in the presence of her gods. It's both. It's in the imagery of the vigils that we see Catelyn performing an almost kind of like nightly ceremony in a sept, right? So we know that knights and would-be knights would spend the night before taking their vows fasting and praying in a church or sept, church in medieval settings, sept here in Westeros. Catelyn is a knight of a different sort. She's a mom. So while she prays to all the gods, she singles out the mother for special attention in the same way that a soon-to-be knight singles out the warrior for his prayers the night before he becomes a knight. And later in A Clash of Kings, she'll make this comparison between the battle on the battlefield and the unique battle that her mother faces quite deliberately. Children are a battle of a different sort. Catelyn started across the yard. A battle without banners or war horns, but no less fierce. Carrying a child, bringing it into the world. Catelyn knows she's on the eve of battle, but she doesn't ready herself to fight in the traditional sense. She prepares her heart as only a mom can, praying for the lives of all the sons and daughter, never forget that Brienne is there too, who are about to fight in the morning. The problem is that Catelyn's vigil is supposed to provide her individual comfort and solicit the gods' help in this time of crisis. But all Catelyn can see in this sept is shifting shadows as the flame flickers back and forth.
All knights bleed, Jamie. That is the seal of our devotion, as Arthur Dane said, but it's not just knights. And yeah, as Varys says, power is a shadow on a wall. We give power its shape, as much as the other way around. The first men show respect for their gods by not naming them, by simply alluding to an ancient power they dare not give a face. In this moment of brokenness, feeling like her family and her country and her very self have been smeared on the highway in history's rearview mirror, Catelyn seems to realize that the Seven were never there. It was only ever her and hers. It was only ever Ned, Robb, Arya, Jon. It was only ever the Lannisters, the Baratheons, her father, her mother, her sister. These are the faces of her life. And so these are the faces she projects onto her gods as light fades from the world. They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. Catelyn says in this chapter that she is dead, that they killed her when they killed Ned. Is this scene showing us what waits after death? A soul standing naked before the fire casting the shadow on the cave wall, still only able to see the puppets of her own life stage play? Or is this scene showing us the essence of life, not death? We are all playing out these archetypes in our life, whether we know it or not. We are all participating in the great wheel of time. The essence of life, the essence of story. Does life require death to give it meaning? Like gods and stories need an audience. Does summer need winter? This is such a bittersweet and emotionally complex moment because even as George is deconstructing the gods, he is reminding us of their enduring power. The fact that gods are just shadows on walls, empty vessels into whom we project our own individual fears and desires, this is a strength, not a weakness. The Father endures, not because there's actually a robed, bearded guy named the Father up there in space, but because you project your father and all the fathers you've known, for better or worse, into him. And that's what storytelling is. Shadow puppets given life by the audience. Crude suggestions into which you project your own story. If that process resonates, then it lingers, passing from story into myth, keystone of collective identity. We complete A Song of Ice and Fire as Catelyn completes the chalk drawings of her gods. And that's what makes this scene one of the most powerful moments in the whole series to me. We are being shown how to relate to songs, stories, heritage, history, culture, meaning, after the bloom has fallen off the rose, after winter has come. Paradoxically, the emptiness of signs and signifiers is precisely why they're so powerful. They are not an iron constant, but the opposite, a fluid, subjective vessel for transformation. They are there to be whatever you need them to be. They change with the flickering of the torchlight. They change as you change. Catelyn is sitting in a dark room, a light projecting still images that seem to be moving, faces she relates to those she knows. Is Catelyn watching a movie? What are movies but religious experiences, transubstantiation on the silver screen, a shaft of light piercing a dark room? They're not real, but their impact is. Master filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu used to say that it is the films that watch us. In the beginning, man made God, a flashlight shining back at us. We tell stories and myths to make sense of not only the world, but ourselves. We are inchoate shapes, writhing masses of contradictory emotions. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. We invent containers, archetypes, ideas of who we are, and then we fill them like liquid or smoke. King, father, mother, Azor Ahai.
That's like that line from the movie that we love so much, and we'll eventually do a Patreon episode about, but it's Kaneda. What do you see? Like, I will not spoil the scene for if you've never seen the movie, but please watch the movie. It's one of the most brilliant scenes in all of cinema. And to kind of borrow from the Apostle Paul again, and continuing from our last quote from the Apostle Paul, what we see now is a dim image in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. What I know now is only partial. Then will be complete as God's knowledge of me. Catelyn can only barely make out the shapes in front of her, and they shift as gusts of wind flicker torchlight back and forth against the wall. It strikes me that Catelyn is having a vision of the flames, so to speak, here, seeing what the fire illuminates and what it doesn't illuminate. And I love what you were saying about the flickering lights as films. You can also call what Melisandre, Axel Florin, I guess, Stannis, and Bakura also see as films too. But it seems as though the film that the R'hllorites are watching is more clear, showing the future or potential futures in the flames. But as Stannis is going to recount in the next Davos chapter, it ain't so clear. Stand before the night fire and you shall see for yourself. The flames shift and dance, never still. The shadows grow tall and short, and every man casts a dozen. Some are fainter than others, that's all. Well, men cast their shadows across the future as well. One shadow or many. Melisandre sees them all. But as we know from Davos smuggling Edric Storm out of Westeros, Melisandre doesn't actually see all. And the true visions glimpsed in the fires are often misinterpreted by Melisandre. And we did reference this quote back in Bran's 5th chapter in Clash of Kings, but let's revisit it again. The vision was a true one, sir. It was my reading that was false. I am as mortal as you, Jon Snow. All mortals err. Please tell me that Melisandre's quote isn't a meta reflection of how fans of various mediums get the wrong interpretation of the stories they love, even if they're looking at them in the bright sunshine and the bright vision that is brought forward by film. But kind of like tying this back to this chapter, Catelyn's interpretation of the shadows on the wall is even less clear than the visions of the flames. It's more like, I don't know, like the after midnight cinema that was inexplicably scrambled when I attempted to watch it as a teen. You know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. And of course, Catelyn's view here is being clouded by not only grief, but as she says, hunger and just lack of sleep. And all these things, of course, just create a certain hallucinatory effect on her. She's kind of slipping in and out of consciousness. And so all she needs is the faint suggestion of a face on a wall, like a cave painting, like the simplest form of communication and culture and art imaginable, to just project all the overwhelming rush of emotions and backstories at play in the war. She is reading the faces of the Seven like we read the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Just as we notice parallels between characters who are in different families and on different sides of the war, Catelyn sees Cersei's eyes in Lysa's face, which is a great way of expressing that concept. This is political commentary and meta-narrative commentary at the same time. George is saying both that these characters he's writing have much in common, and also that accordingly, maybe they shouldn't be waging this destructive civil war. If I would fight and die to keep my children safe, Catelyn thinks as she feels the knife wounds on her fingers, how can I judge Cersei for doing the same? It led to this war, it led to my husband's death, but I don't mourn the man who tried to kill Bran. Why not? That guy had a family. I'm sure they're mourning him. Why should Cersei mourn anyone who might have endangered her children? Cersei's children are children, like Catelyn's children. No matter whether you project Jaime or Robert's face onto the father, whichever shadow on the wall, we have motives in common. We have archetypes in common, fears and desires in common. All of this applies to Stannis and Renly, of course. And that's what makes it such a tragedy that one kills the other. We kill each other. We set our hearts on fire, not because we are so different, but because we are the same. That crack that Catelyn sees running down the mother's eye like a tear as she thinks to herself, that expresses so much. She compares it to her mother, of course. You could also see it as the mother, the goddess, weeping that Stannis has smuggled R'hllor into Westeros, like Davos smuggled his onions. It is the mother that Davos thinks he hears after the Blackwater, reproaching Team Dragonstone for, quote, calling the fire. Or you can imagine that this weeping mother on the wall is Cassandra, Stannis and Renly's mother, weeping from beyond the grave, just like Joanna Lannister in A Feast for Crows, for what's become of her family. Or you could see the mother weeping on the wall as Catelyn, a mother weeping that her sons must think her, quote, cold and unnatural, a mother who, as she says, was not with the father when he died. Or you could see it as just a crack in the wall. It only looks like a tear because Catelyn says so, and if she was in a good mood, maybe it wouldn't look like a tear to her in the first place. The red comet is whatever you want it to be. Stories crack you open and reveal you, not the other way around. All these shadows that seem to haunt a Clash of Kings are mirrors, windows onto not what's outside you, but what's inside you. Now, as Septon Marable will say in A Feast for Crows, these higher mysteries are not only abstract, they're also not terribly comforting. And so he keeps the simpler ways in public with his flock. But Catelyn knows that the Seven are one. that the mother can be as fierce as the father, that the crone can be as beautiful as the maiden. And again, this is in part about storytelling. Even as creators use those archetypes, they should flesh them out in a way that speaks to their common humanity. Yet that common humanity only becomes clear because of those archetypes. These opposing categories gives you a framework by which to judge similarities. That is the usefulness of character archetypes, broad and simplistic as they often are. They briefly clarify the vast contradictory nature of humanity so we can connect the dots. There's the phenomenon in filmmaking called the Kuleshov effect, wherein if you show an audience an image of a man's neutral expression after a shot of delicious food, they will say, he looks hungry. But if you show them the same image of a neutral expression after a shot of rotting garbage, they will say, he looks disgusted. And what does this demonstrate? That the central art of filmmaking isn't the shot, it's the cut. Two images put together is what matters, not one on its own, because the audience mind will intuitively bridge the gap and therefore create meaning, even when that meaning isn't intended. Shadow on a wall. And so opposing archetypes like Stannis and Renly, in their collision, create more meaning together than they ever could have on their own individually. Out of 7, 1. Thesis plus antithesis equals truth. And we see that in action with CATELYN. By understanding these similarities, faces running into one another in the torchlight, she is able to discover truth. She combines Stannis' revelations with the projected play of light across the crude faces left by anonymous villagers to arrive at an answer to her questions. Ned must have known. Bran knows too. That was why they tried to kill him in his bed. Spiritual journeys like this one are always about finding the truth, after all. You make yourself naked before the truth, and the truth returns the favor. Now, it's worth noting that CATELYN's truth isn't true in the strictest sense. Joffrey is responsible for Ned's death and the dagger sent after Bran, not actually his parents trying to cover up the nature of his birth. And once more, CATELYN misses the hidden knife of Littlefinger, because her own projections and biases as a reader, you could say, prevent her from seeing him as the stranger. She also, of course, can't see herself as the stranger, which is exactly what happened when she returned as Lady Stoneheart. Again, the shadow is a mirror. But as with the comet, as with the carved masks of the gods, what matters is what you bring to the table and what you take away. Because ultimately, again, there's no one actually in there with CATELYN. The gods aren't there. It really is just her. And CATELYN walks away from that feeling strong enough to make a last attempt at peace. The knowledge she has uncovered in her sacred quest drives her on. The faces she saw were projections. The truth she uncovered is just another shadow on the wall. But does that really matter if it's helping her do the right thing? You don't fix faith, it fixes you. The power of the shadow on the wall is precisely that it's immaterial. CATELYN found a strength that was within her all along, but she needed the vessel of 7 crude drawings expressing one singular truth.
Excellently said, sir. I think that's brilliant analysis of this part of the chapter. I think when we're talking about like faith fixing you, we can talk about it in terms of whether faith is objectively true or not, which is a debate that'll never cease and never end and never be resolved. But I think also too, you can look at the impact that faith can have for both good and ill on the people in the real world and the people of Westeros. You know, Maribold does good work in A Feast for Crows, and he's driven by his faith. But other people, like the High Sparrow, are driven by their faith to do bad work. And so a lot of these, it is essentially, in Westeros at least, it is an empty vessel which people can project their own self into that and then draw something out of that as well, which ends up informing their own personal narratives. And I promise that this is the final Bible verse I'm going to say here. I know people are coming that if you've come to a Song of Ice and Fire church from the live cast portion of it. All the same, there is something powerful in empowering and thinking and emoting in silence. Be silent in the Lord's presence. This comes from Psalms. And wait patiently for him. Don't be angry because of the one whose way prospers or the one who implements evil schemes. Meditation upon your God, or just even silence to hear your own thoughts, can provide clarity. And I often find this in my own life. When I was working on this chapter last night, I was very quiet outside, and it was really lovely to kind of like sit there in the silence and just kind of hear my thoughts and kind of have them pour out onto the page here. CATELYN has found herself in the midst of silence, and when she emerges from her vigil, she's stronger than when she entered it. And she's also leaving this vigil, as you were saying, with a plan, a final plea for peace.
Absolutely. And as Catelyn sets out for Renly's tent to make her final plea for peace, we see that beautiful prose that I talked about earlier. And this is some of George's best imagery. The long ranks of man and horse were armored in darkness, as black as if the smith had hammered night itself into steel. There were banners to her right, banners to her left, and rank on rank of banners before her. But in the pre-dawn gloom, neither colors nor sigils could be discerned. A gray army, Catelyn thought. Gray men on gray horses beneath gray banners. As they sat their horses waiting, Renly's shadow knights pointed their lances upward. So she rode through a forest of tall, naked trees, bereft of leaves and life. Where Storm's End stood was only a deeper darkness, a wall of black through which no stars could shine. But she could see torches moving across the fields, where Lord Stannis had made his camp. The candles within Renly's pavilion made the shimmering silken walls seem to glow, transforming the great tent into a magical castle alive with emerald light. 2 of the rainbow guards stood sentry at the door to the royal pavilion. The green light shone strangely against the purple plums of Sir Parman's surcoat, and gave a sickly hue to the sunflowers that covered every inch of Sir Emond's enameled yellow plate. Long silken plumes flew from their helms, and rainbow cloaks draped their shoulders. Ooh, I just love every word of that. The knight itself is steel, a set of armor, like Renly's. But Renly's armor is green, and this is black. So this must be Stannis' armor, night falling over the army that will be his. As such, all the gorgeous colors that defined Renly's camp at Bitterbridge back in Catelyn II have fallen away, replaced by gray, capturing the moral ambiguity of both Renly's campaign and Stannis' lethal response. What's the right thing to do? The spears are framed as trees, because as I said before, Renly stands in for the children of the forest, overwhelmed by the First Men, and the First Men overwhelmed by the Andals, and the Andals overwhelmed by the Targaryens. The trees suffered with each successive wave. So in the midst of R'hllor's wave, naturally the trees are seen as bereft of leaves and life. They've been converted to weapons, they're about to be put in service of a hungry fire god, and will soon burn at the Blackwater, just like the Storm's End gods would. Speaking of Storm's End, it is written as a wall of black, blotting out the sky. Again, it's a parallel to the wall up in the north. Stannis' men hold torches, as they will at the wall. The lights in the darkness, as Melisandre says. But are they? As we'll see in Davos 2, bright lights can cast terrible shadows. And as Loras says in A Storm of Swords, when the sun has set, no candle can replace it. And this is a terrific visual metaphor for Stannis' campaign. Is his torch worth the destruction of sun and stars? Is his crown worth the murder of his own brother? He comes north to save Westeros as its king, but his torches burn the wildlings' tree gods, leaving them alone in the dark. His candle cannot replace their sun. In his efforts to save the world, will Stannis reduce what he's trying to save to ash?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And recall here at this point in this juncture in the story, Stannis is still in cart before the horse territory. He's willing to burn down his family, his castle, the godswood that stood for centuries at Storm's End to achieve a crown which will definitely work as a substitute for the love he was denied his entire life, right? No. But as you point out, even when Stannis' outlook shifts in a more positive direction, placing the defense of the kingdom ahead of the crown, it's still animated by a destructive, fiery impulse. If it had stopped with the burning of the Seven on the beach, if it had stopped with Renly, if it had stopped with Edric Storm, if it had stopped with the burning of the werewoods and the forced conversion of the wildlings, if. It all ends in one final act of destruction, as we talked about in the second part of our prologue chapter for A Clash of Kings, in one which will be ironically rooted in his desire to safeguard Westeros ahead of his crown in the lineage of House Baratheon. When Stannis burns Shireen Baratheon, his daughter, in either the Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring, his motivation may be drawn from Davos's later A Storm of Swords statement that he placed the kingdom before the crown. In Clash, in Storm, in Dance, in the Winds of Winter, Stannis is the living embodiment of destroying the village that is his gods, his castle, his ancestors' gods, his brother, his daughter, to save the village, Westeros.
That's perfectly put. And the only color persisting in this fallen world is Renly's tent. Amidst the wall of black and the forest of gray, it glows green, a magical castle alive with light. Now you could read this as Renly being the true light in the darkness, as he undoubtedly thinks of himself. But George immediately undercuts this. The green light clashes horribly with the plums and sunflowers decorating the Rainbow Guard Knights outside the tent. And again, this is a brilliant visual metaphor. We are being shown how Renly's campaign has, if anything, too much color, where Stannis has too little. Renly's signature green is clashing with his followers' colors, creating not a gorgeous rainbow, but a sickly cacophony. It's too much of a good thing, contrasting with the abandoned village and its simple chalk sketches of the gods. Describing the emerald light of the candle through the canvas as magical also sets up the magical phenomenon about to occur in that tent. But of course, this magic doesn't belong to Renly, like the tent does, and indeed will kill him. And that's another reason for George to describe the green light as clashing horribly with the Rainbow Guard's armor. Renly thinks that magical light belongs to him along with everything else, but it's about to turn against him and his summer nights. Winter has come for them. It also makes me think about the green light in Great Gatsby, standing in for romance and happiness forever just out of reach. That's Renly and his peach for Stannis in his dreams. And that's what the memory of Renly will be for Loras and Brienne. And this imagery continues inside the tent. George describes Renly's green armor as being like a forest, with the gold highlights looking like distant fires in that wood, as if Renly's armor is like a window back onto the outside, as if the imagery outside has carried over to the inside. Those distant fires are the torches that Catelyn saw burning in Stannis' camp, and the shadows they cast are coming for Renly. Not only will his armor fail to save him, it foreshadows his death, as if his death is coming from inside him, from his own preparations, from his own war machine. The call is coming from inside the house. But even as you go through each specific image in this passage, and you can talk about what they mean, it's important to consider them together as a whole. What's the strategy here? Taken together, what these images do is establish a strong visual presence in our mind. Just like how Catelyn was metaphorically watching a movie in the Sept, George is relying on a cinematic use of color to ground us in the scene. He knows that if we are watching this scene unfold in our mind's eye, not just reading it but seeing it, the Shadow Baby's arrival will be all the more nightmarishly effective. After all, the Shadow Baby attack is all visual. The audience needs to see it unfold, just as Catelyn does, for it to stick with us. And we're more likely to be able to picture it now that George has done all this work grounding us in the imagery. And that's an important lesson for a writer to learn. When you have a big signature moment like Renly's death, you need to prime the audience for it. Ground them in the visuals, the tone, and your big moment will land so much more than it would have in isolation because your audience's collective shoulders are already hunched.
Exactly. And George lets the silence of Catelyn at the Sept, the gloom of the early morning, the sickening look of how the green colors play against the Rainbow Knights direct the readers towards the feeling that something big is coming. It makes us feel kind of uneasy, while then also making us feel that nothing bad could possibly happen here, right? Just look at how big of an army Renly has around him. He has Rainbow Knights standing right outside of the tent. He's got the two greatest lords of Westeros in here too. And then there's Brienne in the tent as well. And we saw her win at the melee at Bitterbridge, so she's practically indestructible. And then you got Renly himself, armored to the fucking teeth. Literally, dude. Like the mask, like this helmet is all the way on his face. Oh my goodness. George spends a ton of time describing how every breastplate, gauntlet, helmet, and piece of armor is attached to Renly. He comes off, to me, seeming like an armor tank surrounded by other armored tanks. But that sinking feeling that George is imbuing to the scene, the silence, the unease. Now that's how you do a twist, man, when it comes to writing. You set it up so you have the mood indicating one thing and the visuals indicating something else. It's brilliant on George's part.
That's a really good point. With the literal structures around Renly, he's setting up Renly as untouchable, but with the tone and imagery, he's hinting that all those layers of protection are about to fall apart at once around Renly, and then the entire army is going to have to swirl around and reconceive of itself. Before that, of course, Catelyn enters the tent to find Brienne armoring Renly for battle. A battle that won't happen, and the armor won't protect him, because as the light indicates, we are in the domain of magic now, and magic cares not for your armor or large armies. But for the moment, Renly is going over strategy with his most experienced and cunning lords, Mathis Rowan and Randall Tarly. Tarly, of course, is the military mind. Rowan seems to be the more politically minded one. We see that in how he glances carefully at Catelyn before continuing, wondering if she can be trusted. Rowan is encouraging Renly to attack before dawn. Of course he is. Hasn't that been this whole campaign? The Lords of the Reach using Renly as a vessel, a Rorschach blot, a shadow on the wall to grab as much power as they possibly can? And Renly shoots back that this would be most unchivalrous, and he doesn't want his reputation to suffer. And this perfectly captures Renly's strengths and weaknesses. On the one hand, he's always got a watchful eye towards his audience, thinking about his image because it is the source of his power. He is a very good politician. On the other, Renly didn't seem to give a damn about respecting Stannis and doing the right thing when it came to claiming the crown itself. Same goes for his command that Stannis' corpse be respected. That's nice and all, but you're still only killing him. You're still only making the corpse in the first place to silence the truth and cement your own power. Renly makes minor concessions to honor in the context of a deeply dishonorable campaign. It's also how the Tyrells work. He learned it from watching them. It's like how he clearly intends to revert to the strict primogeniture status after shattering it in his own case. Renly wants to get past how he's coming to power. He wants to be able to tell himself he's being chivalrous even as he kills Stannis. Catelyn is here to prevent him from just moving past all of this. After her spiritual journey in the Sept, she has come to stand up for the truth. Meanwhile, Renly is busy ignoring the advice of Randyll Tarly, his best general, and prepares instead to send the unexperienced Loras Tyrell into the teeth of the rising sun. As such, he might not even be able to kill Stannis after all, honorably or otherwise. And how ironic is it that Renly, repeatedly associated with the sun, fails to respect its power? That perfectly sums up his superficiality, how he refuses to take power seriously, even as he accumulates more of it than any of the other kings.
I absolutely agree. And we're also seeing why it's so crucial, the roles that Jon Arryn and Ned Stark played in moderating Robert's hot-headedness. Jon Arryn seemingly provided the stable hand of governance of Westeros, while Catelyn notes that Ned would have counseled Renly not to make the headlong, heedless rush to Storm's End without his baggage trains and the rest of his army. But no disrespect to Mathis Rowan, who seems like a okay person for a Southern Lord, and every disrespect to Randyll Tarly, they're no Jon Arryn nor Ned Stark, respectively. But even if they were made of the same stuff that Jon Arryn and Ned Stark were in their leadership abilities, they'd still be on Renly's side for seeming ignoble reasons. They're two men who have thrown their lot in with Renly for, as Stannis correctly notes in Davos' second chapter, no better reason than dreams of power and glory. And that type of mentality has its impacts on leaders and how leaders lead. At a core level, Ned Stark and Jon Arryn supported Robert from the get-go because of the injustice and murder perpetrated by Aerys II Targaryen. They came into the war with a righteous Casus Belli on their side. They, or at least Ned, left feeling not nearly so justified in rebelling as they started, to be fair. But that's such a contrast to these other two lords, Randyll Tarly and Mathis Rowan. These guys were first Targaryen loyalists, then ostensibly loyal to Robert, now Renly, later Joffrey and Tommen, and will probably end up on young Griff's side in the Winds of Winter. Their loyalty is to their own self-interest, ultimately. And so long as what the king says or does doesn't interfere with that, they're not going to object, though Mathis might look fit to gag at such orders. He's basically the Barristan Selmy in lordly form. When the order is finally given by the king, they're the shut-up and color types, seeing only the end state rather than the road littered with the corpses of the Knights of Summer.
Perfectly said. Right after that, though, there is an important exchange about Stannis that, in my opinion, comes the closest to a real justification for Renly's coup. Tarly asks what happens if Stannis yields. Rowan laughs at that, reminding Tarly that Stannis ate rats when he was the one holding Storm's End against them. He'll break before he bends. As Asha says, he'll never turn back from his course. On one hand, this elevates Stannis above a world dominated by corruption and indulgence. Rowan seems to have some grudging admiration for Stannis' resilience, and I think the readers are supposed to share that admiration to an extent. Because then Renly chimes in with his own memories of the Siege of Storm's End, and in the process explains his attitude towards his big brother. As I said in our CATELYN 3 episodes, one of the reasons Stannis is so furious at Renly is that he starved in part to keep Renly out of the hands of the Mad King. Stannis never got those calories back. That's probably why he's so skinny compared to his brothers. And now here comes Renly with his feasts, stealing Stannis' crown, ignoring the sacrifice that was made for him. I do sympathize with Stannis there. But as in CATELYN 3, we have to consider how this looks from Renly's perspective. And from Renly's perspective, Stannis is the punisher, not the savior. Stannis was the man who strapped down their master-at-arms, a man Renly had known and presumably liked for his whole young life, and prepared to catapult him off the walls of Storm's End, where he would explode. Renly can't forget the man's eyes. This is horrifying. This is the same heinous shit Joffrey will pull at the Battle of Blackwater, catapulting Stannis loyalists into the middle of the battle. Now, of course, Stannis is not a cackling sadist like Joffrey or the Mad King. As Davos thinks to himself in A Storm of Swords, there had been no anger in Stannis when he cut off Davos's fingers, only an iron sense of justice. Stannis is not a monster. He is a well-intentioned man committed to a worldview that is irreconcilable with reality. But does that distinction matter to his victims? Would Sir Gawain Wild have suffered any less from his catapulting because his killer was trying to do the right thing rather than slate a sadistic urge? There is no creature on earth half so terrifying as a truly just man, after all. Stannis only holds back because Crescent tells him that, hey, we might have to eat those guys if the siege continues. Why fling away meat? So he only avoids one atrocity by preserving the opportunity to commit another one. Same deal with Davos, saving Edric Storm's life from Stannis, but failing to convince his king that sacrificing innocence is in general unacceptable. It's galling to come back after A Dance with Dragons and realize what a hypocrite Stannis is on the subject of cannibalism. During the Siege of Storm's End, cannibalism was a prospect he was actively considering, enough to influence his decision-making. But when the Peasbury men do it to not die on the march to Winterfell, oh, that's over the line, and they have to not only die, but burn to death while screaming, even though the men they ate were already dead?
You make a fair point, I think, and it's definitely hypocrisy. But as always, with the Stand Man, it's hypocrisy with pragmatic purpose. Don't fling Gawain over the walls. We might need to put meat back on the menu. Don't do cannibalism with Dance Dragons, or his army will cease to be. And I totally get George's intent to show Stannis as a hypocrite here, that a just man can act unjustly and act against his principles. But I like that George makes Stannis' hypocrisy a pragmatic, greater good sword rather than a purely self-interested one. The problem, as ever, for Stannis is that no one can see past the Dark Lord vibes he's putting out because he never or rarely explains himself and his actions and his rationale.
Exactly right. Best work in the dark, for better or worse. And Stannis may see himself as a font of justice in an unjust world. That's how Crescent and Davos see him too, and they have reason to see him that way. But that's not how Renly sees him. For Renly, Stannis is forever associated with the look of horror in Gawain Wild's eyes and the memory of him dying in his cell. This is what monsters do, as far as Renly is concerned. The Tyrells, his future in-laws, are the ones who fed him after the siege ended. Now we can sputter and shout and point out that the Tyrells are the ones who denied him food in the first place. But that doesn't change the effectiveness of it. The same pattern persists after the Blackwater. The people of King's Landing embraced the Tyrells for delivering food. Even though it was the Tyrells cutting off supplies to the capital, that led to mass starvation in the first place. It works. Politically, it works. We don't have to like it, but it does. Bread and circuses is a cliched phrase for a reason. This is why Renly doesn't think of his actions as crossing the line. To him, Stannis crossed the line into inhumanity long ago. Mm-hmm. He is the boogeyman from Renly's childhood, and so Renly thinks the realm will suffer with Stannis as the king. Now, I don't adhere to Renly's logic, but I do understand it. I don't think this would make him a good king, but I do appreciate why he thinks Stannis would be a bad one.
And I think, as we were saying for the opening question, Stannis would be a bad king here in A Clash of Kings, and probably a bad one by the end of A Dance with Dragons. Definitely one by the end of The Winds of Winter. But in my mind, there's a real distinction between Renly and Stannis and how they reflect on their actions. As we're going to see in Davos' second chapter, Stannis has given a lot of thought to his hypocritical pardons of these Southern lords. You are right to reproach me, Davos. I have punished men for lesser deeds than what I am doing with these men. I have forgiven them and atoned them because I need their armies. Stannis, to me, has always struck me as wholly introspective to a fault, again, rarely communicating his reasons and forcing readers to infer or theorize on them. But Renly's lack of introspection kind of bothers me. No, it really, really bothers me. He starves an entire city and doesn't expend so much as a wink thinking about the city or hell, even empathizing with those suffering from his direct action. For me, hell, I'd even take Renly reflecting on his own backstory as someone who suffered the same fate as the King's Landers are currently experiencing. Is he unaware? I kind of doubt it. Renly seems quite intelligent. Instead, I think he never talks about this piece of it because he knows he has to shroud his campaign in chivalrous optics. And he has something like plausible deniability here, too. Plus, Any reminders of Storm's End that don't paint Stannis as that Dark Lord I was referencing earlier are damaging to the optics of Renly's cause. Wait, Renly, you're trying to kill the guy who starved to save your life from captivity or execution by the Tyrells, by Aerys Targaryen's loyalists? That doesn't seem like a really just cause on your behalf.
Perfectly put. Yeah, I think that he has to frame it. Renly is always reframing himself for the new audience, as you've said in these chapters. So when the lords depart and Renly grants Catelyn an opportunity to make her case for peace, Brienne stays behind, continuing to armor him in splendor, hinting that it's already too late. Catelyn lays out the narrative that has emerged clear in her head, putting all the bits and pieces together into a single explanation of what has happened to power in Westeros. She has seen, in her mind, what is casting the shadow on the wall. The opening moves at Winterfell in Book 1 return to prominence. The first big twist of the story, Bran's fall, takes center stage as the key moment in determining not only what's happened to Westeros, but what happens now. All of A Song of Ice and Fire so far has collapsed into this single moment. Catelyn puts forward a proposal that could bring about peace in the name of truth, a great council. Let's stop the war. Let's put down our crowns and swords and talk honestly about what has happened to our country. Let us put innocence despoiled, the injuries inflicted on children by the Game of Thrones, at the center of the conversation. Let us offer a clear, coherent objection to the source of our ills. As Davos says in A Dance with Dragons, they are all suffering because the Lannisters stole the throne. Of course, there is a whole lot wrong with Westeros beyond that. As we saw with Chiswick's story, there was a whole lot wrong with Westeros united and at peace under one king. But the war makes everything worse. And it's very difficult to make anything better as long as the war continues. Catelyn is doing the right thing here, committing herself to sacrificing Robb's pride on behalf of the restoration of peace and truth. There is room for debate on how realistic this is. We'll talk about the ambiguous precedent set by previous great councils later, but in isolation, Catelyn's proposal relies on Stannis setting down his crown, which he won't. It's also not guaranteed that she could persuade Robb into accepting the council's authority either. Maybe even if he was personally up to it, he might fear that his lords wouldn't go for it.
It kind of seems that way when you get to A Storm of Swords, that Robb's like, I really can't do what you're asking me to do to set the crown aside because my lords would just kill the shit out of me if I did that. But I do kind of wonder whether there's a kind of Jon Snow putting his kingship aside to save the kingdom vibe. Kind of a bit of foreshadowing work in this chapter. I mean, we saw that in season 7 of the Emmy Award-winning show known as Game of Thrones. Have you seen it? That Jon did what Robb probably couldn't do, and what Renly and Stannis will absolutely refuse to do. He sets his crown aside for the greater good, gives his crown up to Daenerys Targaryen in order to save Westeros from the coming apocalypse. Now, the stakes seemingly at this point are not as high as they were in season 7 of the show, but they're fucking coming, man. Those stakes are still present even at this juncture in A Clash of Kings.
I think that this is a setup for that later struggle, right? This is the last chance to unite against the largest threat of the Lannisters, just like Westeros, as you zoom out, still has a chance to stand together against the others. If Renly really was the good king, he would set his crown aside at this moment, like Jon in the show, like Maester Aemon, embrace the truth and the chance for peace. And doing so wouldn't even be that much of a sacrifice on his part, because the odds are good that Renly would triumph at that council and pick his crown right back up again. Renly is likable. Stannis is not. Renly already has the reach and Stormland votes at said council in his back pocket. Stannis has no allies, no friends. That's how he is in this position to begin with. Renly would likely emerge as the sole legitimate king for every faction other than the Lannisters, and then probably defeat the Lannisters with ease. And if he did that, Renly would indeed be the rightful king, in my opinion. And if Stannis continued to resist him after that, he would be an unambiguous villain.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, imagine the heroic chivalric optics that would practically lift Renly onto the Iron Throne. One man selfishly places the crown aside to right the wrongs of the kingdom and determine who is going to be the actual king of Westeros. It's a golden opportunity to win yet more of Westeros to his side without lifting a single sword, which is kind of what he's been trying to do, at least through the end of Catelyn's second chapter in The Clash of Kings. So it's not even that it's just the right thing to do; it's the smart tactical decision that Renly could have made in this juncture.
Exactly right. It's not just noble, it's also he could still win. Like Melisandre at the Parlay in CATELYN IV. Catelyn is giving Renly one last chance to repent and do the right thing for himself as well as Westeros. And just like at the Parlay, Renly refuses. In fact, he laughs in her face because Renly takes nothing seriously to the end. Even a slight risk to his power is unacceptable. Why should he risk it? In Renly's mind, force offers a guarantee of victory, so he commits to stripping society down to brute force. Renly asks CATELYN if direwolves vote on who leads the pack. And no, they don't, but we're not direwolves. We're humans. We left the state of nature long ago. And of course, there was, whole branches of philosophy arguing in the other direction. Philosophers like Rousseau, who venerate the state of nature and argue that humanity's inherent nature is good, and that is distorted and corrupted by all the systems and institutions that we heap upon our shoulders. We beat that good nature out of ourselves. But the cynical flip side of that is our systems and institutions are what separate us from pure survival of the fittest. And that gets at the great duality of Renly Baratheon. Is he like a utopian optimist who just thinks everything is going to work out because he's great? Or is he really the most cynical person in Westeros? Is he a social Darwinist? Mm-hmm. The time for talk is done, he says. Why? Because Renly says so? Because diplomacy is canceled the second it might be inconvenient for the self-declared best king? And then comes the single most crucial line of dialogue delivered by Renly Baratheon, exposing the rot behind the glittering surface. Now we see who is stronger. As in Goodfellas, your killer has come to you with a smile, pretending to be your friend. The court jester is violently promoting himself to king, laughing all the while. As Sandor tells the Brotherhood, maybe the sword's prettier, with ribbons hanging off of it, but it will kill you just as dead. By the same token that Stannis' sense of justice doesn't comfort his victims, the atmosphere of wine and roses surrounding Renly doesn't erase the blood he's happy to have on his hands. Now we see who is stronger. The Game of Thrones has stripped down every bond we might have with one another, national and personal alike. You win or you die. Renly has put it all on the line to win, but as we will see next week, he's going to die instead.
That's so brilliantly said. I love that. And I love what you were saying earlier about how Renly saw Stannis as a monster in his youth and how that colors his impression of his brother to this present day in A Clash of Kings. And while I absolutely think that Renly exposes himself as the real monster just before the shadow baby monster rolls in, I do kind of see where Renly is coming from. Renly has built Stannis up to be essentially Sauron, right? And you cannot negotiate with Dark Lords or Adolf Hitler. They will only bind and enslave you to their will. Now, as you were saying, Stannis is not Sauron in temperament and action. He's not objectively that way anyways. He's a pretty gray dude who can negotiate and be a bit flexible. But in Renly's mind, he did his part in good faith, which absolutely was not, to talk. And now they see who is stronger. Hey, Donald Noyes said something about this in Jon's first chapter in Clash of Kings about Stannis, right? Stannis is pure iron, black and hard and strong.
It's those great perfect parallels between these two characters. It's been the core of what we've been talking about all through the Baratheon brothers story. They're so different and yet so similar. Mm-hmm. So I think that takes us into foreshadowing and groundwork. Sir, what's being set up in this chapter?
Oh, man, we have a bunch of stuff that's being set up in the second half. But we have a couple things for the first half of this chapter, too. So George is reminding us in the first part of this chapter that Barristan Selmy appears to have just simply dropped off the face of the earth. If he's not with Robb or Renly or Stannis, where could he be? He's with the Greyjoys, right? He's obviously with, Balon Greyjoy. He's supporting the rightful king of Rock and Salt there on the Iron Islands, right? No, of course not. He's headed for Daenerys Targaryen, and Renly is right that Barristan needs a monarch to guard. But he never considers that said monarch might be a Targaryen. He might want to serve the Targaryens once again.
Exactly. That's the great little joke, is that they dance around every single possible option of where Barristan could be, except the king he's actually going to be with, the monarch he's actually going to be with, who's Dany. So, similar to the scene with Catelyn in the Sept, Sansa will pray to the Seven and shiver at the sight of the stranger before the Blackwater. And this is just one of many moments in common between mother and daughter, and it cements the idea we've been talking about, that Stannis is the stranger given flesh. George wants to reemphasize that idea at the crucial moments in the Baratheon storyline in A Clash of Kings.
Right, and I love the imagery of the strangers having a dark face with shining eyes, which is something that we see in characters like Quaithe. Is she the stranger as well? I'm not sure. I kind of was reading this chapter and be like, is that Quaithe? But no, I sure hope not. But yeah, definitely the imagery is being associated with Stannis as the stranger, which gets repeated over and over and over again, as we talked about in Catelyn's third chapter. Third little bit of foreshadowing is that Catelyn wonders if the old gods ever talk to Ned when she's in the Sept. And we see this in A Dance with Dragons, actually, when Bran speaks the word Winterfell through the heart tree, and Ned whirls around wondering who was there. And I have to imagine we're going to see a bit more of that in Bran's chapters come the Winds of Winter, where Bran is going to be able to speak to his father. And I do wonder how those conversations are going to go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, these conversations with the gods, it can be a lot less metaphorical when it comes to Bran's powers. You can have these direct conversations, although they're as dangerous as they are, you know, tantalizing for sure, given what Bloodraven warns him about. And of course, speaking of Bran, you have this very interesting line from CATELYN when she's talking about the council she could possibly set up. We will send to Winterfell, so Bran may tell his tale, and all men may know the Lannisters for the true usurpers. Let the assembled lords of the Seven Kingdoms choose who shall rule them. In the wake of season 8 of the show, is that King Bran foreshadowing that he's being called down from Winterfell to tell his story, and then a king will be chosen to rule by the assembled lords of the Seven Kingdoms? In this case, Bran himself. It might be.
Who has the best story but Bran Stark, right? I mean, it's a much not love line by the fandom, but I think it's actually a pretty interesting and cool line. I would think that George was probably going to go with something like that come Dream of Spring, where Bran's story is going to influence why he is chosen by a great council to become the king of all of Westeros, or king of the North, as some believe, so to speak. But that does kind of like take us into an interesting discussion for the final piece of this analysis, which is, what about these great councils, right?
What about them indeed? I mean, this is one of the more frustrating areas of like a Song of Ice and Fire backstory to get into, because the great councils pop up all over the place, but they're contradictory and don't set much of a strong precedent, which I think is mostly deliberate on George's part, because he wants to show how they're kind of like stopgap efforts and band-aids, and potentially CATELYN's would have been this one as well. But, you know, when we're talking about the great councils of Westeros, the first big one we talk about is the Council of 101, in terms of, you know, setting the record straight in terms of how primogeniture between genders work in the wake of a bunch of kerfuffles about who's going to be the heir of the old king, Jaehaerys I.
Yeah, so the Council of 101 was all about who's, like I was saying, who's going to inherit from Jaehaerys I. And it ends up essentially ratifying this idea of male-line agnatic primogeniture, which essentially means that the first male is going to inherit unless there's basically no males left. There's a bit of nuance there, which I'm not really engaging with at this point in that council. That council, to me, it feels like one that doesn't have as much relevance to the potential great council that CATELYN wants to call. But I think I think that there's a bit of precedent there, and that we're seeing. Could you call it proto-democracy about the lords of Westeros choosing who is going to be actually inherit from Jaehaerys I? I don't want to definitively say that George is sourcing this to historical things, but you could see the potential that the elements of democracy are kind of forming as a kind of ether matter from which a potential republic could spring in Westeros at some point down the road.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you see a little effort to set down a standard that will prove stable and prove useful for handling transitions of power, but of course, it just immediately leads to greed growing up on both sides of the issue when it gets forced during the Dance of Dragons. So immediately people say, "Oh, that didn't really work out in terms of setting an established president can live with." So then we move on to the Council of 136. You know, we have the council in the wake of the destruction of the Dance with Dragons.
Right. So Aegon III calls a council in order to replace the members of the small council that have either turned traitorous or have died. All the events for that have ensued from the Dance of the Dragons. And we do get a small council chosen by the High Lords. So is this the potential, like, again, ether and ember matter, which can then spring forward some sort of like representative democracy, like the Senate or the House of Representatives in the American system, or the houses in Parliament in the UK system? Again, I'm not sure if it has a lot of direct relevance to this council that CATELYN wants to call, but I think it is interesting in talking about the foundation for choosing people who are going to advise the king that you've already elected, right? Potentially someday down the road.
Yeah, I mean, again, you see this attempt to resolve a massive dispute created by the great, ego and collisions of kings, and you see like this wellspring of the lords is like, okay, we can fall back on this power structure. We can make sense of things at the lord level when the royal family is falling apart. But then, of course, that leads to the question of, well, why aren't we just in charge? Period. Which kind of starts to feed into Robert's Rebellion eventually. But before we get to Robert's Rebellion, of course, we have the Council of 233, which I think is the most kind of relevant one in terms of talking about Stannis and Renly, because it's the one we know some details about in terms of these different factions and about why like a compromise candidate emerged.
Right. So the Council of 233 has basically the Targaryens attempted to choose who's going to be the next king of Westeros. So we have something similar to the Council of 101, although in this case, because the Council of 101 established male agnatic primogeniture, we don't actually have any female claims put forward, if I'm not mistaken. I think there might have been one, if now that I'm thinking about it. Ultimately, though, who gets chosen but Aegon V, the unlikely, after the crown is offered to Aemon Targaryen, and after, of course, the Blackfyre claim is rudely rejected, shall we say, in this claim. So this council, I think, like you were saying, has probably the most relevance to what we're talking about with Catelyn's story, and that we have the Lords of Westeros choosing essentially someone who is unlikely to be the king of Westeros. And I want to say, we've been talking about, and you brought this up in the foreshadowing groundwork, that choosing someone who is unlikely to be the king seems to me to be pretty strong foreshadowing for what is going to happen at the end of the story. Likely that Bran Stark will be chosen by a great council as probably the most unlikely person to be chosen. But he does have an interesting story, and that interesting story is likely going to feed into how that choice is going to be made at the end of all time.
Yeah, in so many ways, so many of the big plot points early on in the series are roads not taken that will be taken later. You know what I mean? And this is one of them, where the potential Great Council to decide on a new king, hinted at potentially to be Bran and Catelyn's dialogue, as I was saying, ends up getting forestalled here by Stannis and Renly. Well, more specifically by Renly, but again, Stannis wouldn't have gone for it if he'd bothered to hear the proposal. And so it will play out later with the next generation, with the more reasonable people, or with the people who are just less damaged and full of less baggage and backstory that they've had to go through. And so it's kind of ambiguous. Do you think? How do you feel about great councils, Jeff? Like, do you feel like we're being told that they're the solution, or that they kind of perpetuate the problem?
I feel that when we're looking at these great councils, like the Council of 101, I think made the wrong choice, right? The councils comprised of nobles doesn't necessarily lead to the best results. And the Council of 233 leads to Aegon V, but he is barely chosen over the objections of all these lords who look at him and be like, this guy's been hanging out with the small folk. I don't think we should be having this guy lead our realm, because we don't want any peasant opinions actually entering into the discourse, the hashtag discourse of Westeros. And that is something that I think it speaks against councils. I think councils can make the right choice, but at the same time, when we're talking about elections, to kind of establish, to put it in a broader context, elections can often lead to a bad result. Perhaps the 2016 election could be the most interesting and most recent result, or the recent UK election, the parliamentary election. I think I tend to favor democracy, as a principle. I'm wearing the American flag shirt after all. And that does, I think, lead to better results than simply an inherited monarchy. But do great councils actually work? Do council systems work to bring the best rulers to the fore? Perhaps in a perfect system they do, but humans are flawed, and the nobles of Westeros are flawed above the average. In my opinion, they're flawed much more strongly than the average small folk that is roaming around the world of Westeros.
I think I definitely prefer a more democratic system. I think the question for me is whether councils serve as an effective bridge away from inherited monarchy towards a democratic system, or whether they don't really function that way at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And whether they're just kind of like half steps that inherently fall short and just like bring a lot of biases to the table. Because, like I said, I think if Renly emerged from the Great Council as king, I think he would have, in my opinion, a much stronger claim, because he would have put down his crown in order to enter into that room, thus demonstrating his good intent and, putting it all on the line. It'd be like saying, okay, Renly, you've proven that you care about something more than selfishness and self-advancement. At the same time, that the Great Council would end up probably reifying this guy who I don't think is really up for the job at a substantive level, doesn't speak well to those councils. So it diffuses power a little bit and gets you away from just the spectacle of, oh God, it's that one guy with the crown and he's crazy. So it inherently, I think, blunts some dangers, but I don't think it deals with the real problems. And I think we saw that with Robert. Who put Robert into power? A coalition of lords from across Westeros, and then he sat around.
Right.
So I think it's an improvement. I'm not sure if it's what matters, which is an improvement leading in the right direction, a step that will have other steps after it. I'm not sure I see that in the series yet.
I agree. And I think, we have the potential what if councils. What would have happened if Rhaegar Targaryen had been able to call the council as he wanted to do, potentially at Harrenhal, but he definitely talks with Jaime as Jaime recounts at Feast for Crows about calling a great council to set to right the wrongs that his father had committed. would that actually led to true or real reform? Would Rhaegar's children have been as good as Rhaegar seems to have thought of himself to be? It's impossible to say, as stated over and over in the series. The gods flip a coin, and the head of the coin can land on madness or greatness. And it's a great time to be living in Westeros if the head of the coin is landing on Aegon V or Daeron II or some of these guys who weren't so bad. But it's a bad time to live in Westeros if the coin is landing on Maegor Targaryen or is landing on Aerys II Targaryen. And I think that is what councils, at least in the form that they imagine themselves to be, would prevent these mad kings from rising up to the fore. But I don't think it ultimately would lead to a substantive revolution and reform to the people of Westeros, as well as to the ruling structure of Westeros, which has typically been pretty bad altogether.
Yeah, well said.
It's a hard question, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because, obviously we're projecting forward what Westeros might be like, and we're dealing with our own sense of where the books is going in George's context. So it's so different from projecting politically forward in the real world, which is also fraught with complications and uncertainties. And, I think a lot of what George is trying to get at in this book specifically is these things you think are the obvious automatic solutions to political problems turn out to be more complicated. And that doesn't say you should just throw up your hands and commit to nihilism or say that anyone trying to change things is stupid. Just adopt the South Park approach. But that, you should be skeptical of quick shortcuts. As Dallas says in The Storm of Swords, the shortest road is not necessarily the safest one. And I think just like it's tempting to fall back on Renly and realize and think of him as like, a proto-democrat, when I think he's actually a step backwards. I think the Great Council, you can think about it as like, it diffuses power from just the one king bit. Maybe it just reaffirms the power of vassals like Randall Tarley. And maybe that's not actually better than, reaffirming the power of the Targaryens or the Baratheons.
I absolutely agree there. And I think that is a good spot to conclude for this analysis of A Clash of Kings CATELYN IV, the first part of it anyways. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much to those of you who have been tuning into our live stream. For those of you who are tuning into our live stream, we'll have some questions and answers and some chit chat with you guys, see how you guys are all doing. So stay tuned right after the end of this episode. As always, if you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere and everywhere where you find our podcasts.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF. Follow us on Twitter at NotacastASOIAF, or shoot us an email at notacastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at PoorQuentin or at PoorQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon: Lord of the Squishers and Warden of the Deep, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Maribald, the Shoeless Sage, Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood, Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North and Keeper of Secrets, Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys and Lady of Jameson, Lady Brit, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal, Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood, Sir Tim the Knight, who was guided by voices, Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill, Sir Way, of course, Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore, Lord Mark Connington, heir to Griffin's Roost, Lord Sam Kay, Sir Michael Mertens, Wisdom Benjicott, Alchemist of Sets and Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Boole and De Morgan, Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping, Lady Raj, Mistress of Horse, Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies, and Septon Murrayville Head Affair. Thank you very much to our high lords and ladies.
Absolutely. Thank you, folks, very, very much. So join us next week as we say right here at Storm's End for the second half of CATELYN IV, in which King Terrorist Renly Baratheon is righteously vaporized by a drone strike. Right, Emmett?
That's exactly how I think about it too, sir. It's just pure triumph. We're going to have so much fun with that nightmare of a scene.
It's going to be a lot of fun. So we get to kind of transition from the kind of quiet moments to everything being on fire and Catelyn and Brienne running away for their lives. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you again for so much for you guys for watching us. Thank you to our patrons for supporting us. And we will see you guys, some of you all literally, next time. Whew. That was a good one.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. A smoosh that like if you haven't already. Do us a favor. And then we'll stick around for a while to chat with you. We hope you're all doing well, obviously, in our times. Yeah, times indeed.
How's everybody doing? Everybody doing good? Good, solid. I think they're probably like 10 to 15 seconds behind from what I understand.
Yeah, probably.
Looking at
We're
this,
from the
that's okay.
future.
Yeah, we come in peace.
You do not speak for me in that regard.
All right, we already got questions that are already being lined up here. So, Rob S asks, assuming Stannis dies, do you guys have a theory of how that will come about in the books?
I could potentially see like we don't actually see it happen. Like, Davos comes on the remains of the Night Fort and finds Stannis's body, having, killed himself or by one of his own men or some such. Brienne is also certainly a possibility, as in the show. She does swear an oath to kill him in the books, but then she never thinks about it again. And I understand that the story is ballooning rapidly for George, but I feel like he might want to keep that around as a connective tissue if it was actually going to be the end. What do you think?
I mean, I think he dies at the end of the story. I don't think we had this discussion back. We had a Patreon episode probably almost a year and a half ago now about the fate of Stannis. And I think one of the ways I looked at it is that there's this passage from A Storm of Swords, which talks about Stannis's crown being a crown of fire atop his head as he sees is burning. And we only see one other reference in all the Song of Ice and Fire to a crown of fire on top of someone's head. And that is when that fucking slaver from Dany's chapter is lit on fire by dragons. Does that mean that Stannis is also going to be lit on fire by dragons? I think that's unlikely, but I do think it ultimately speaks to him dying in some fashion or another.
Absolutely. I don't think he's definitely not. I've grown less and less likely to believe that he's going to be surviving to the end. I think he's going to have some sort of death scene.
Mm-hmm. Mick M asks, who has the biggest libido, Robert Baratheon or Oberyn Martell?
Different flavors. I'll say that much. Oberyn's is more active. He'll travel. Robert's like, where are we? Yeah, sure. I'll find someone here.
Mm-hmm. I think that's about right. And I think just me talking here, I think that Roberts is more like sadness. Like he has a sad libido, so to speak. Like all of his sexuality is rooted through him losing Lyanna, or at least that's what he thinks to himself. Of course, as we know that Maya Stone was born before Lyanna Stark was dead, so it wasn't that was non-existent before Robert assumed the kingship and has been before Lyanna died. But I do think that there's a certain sadness in the way that Robert is treating his sexuality in the books when we get to him in A Game of Thrones. Oberyn seems kind of more joyful, at least the way he was.
Libertine, certainly, absolutely.
More libertine, and his portrayal by Pedro Pascal from the show definitely indicated and illuminated that side of him. He's not so much doing it because he's sad. He's doing it because this is fun. And I think that's a better way of looking at that type of behavior, though it's not one I
agreed.
Do. Yeah. Let's see here. Everybody's doing good, which is good for this time of quarantine. Joshmo75 asks, we know the Red God has real power. We know the old gods have power. Do the Seven have any supernatural power? You have an excellent answer to this. You've said before, I think.
We've never been given any indication that the Seven exist on a metaphysical reality, or even that they represent some monster that someone misunderstood as gods. When Tyrion goes to Andalos, nothing mystical happens. Davos overhearing the mother after the Blackwater, same as CATELYN here, you can easily explain this deprivation. And every other religion has something hinted at to be real. I think this is in part just George working through his own feelings about Catholicism, as everyone has said. But, it's also just they're the establishment religion. So in political terms, it just works cynically to say, yeah, they're not the real ones.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you had brought up this point before about when Tyrion is in Andalos in A Dance with Dragons, we don't see any of the gods interacting with the settings of the surroundings as he's up there when he leaves Illyrio's manse. So it seems to indicate that there's not really a whole lot of truth value in what the Seven indicate. Brienne T says, are you guys going to post these live shows on your podcast streams? Yes, every week, and our Patreon stream. So if you're listening, if you love the audio side of it and want to catch up, or you miss some of the episode, all these episodes we posted on our Patreon for our patrons at various tiers. They'll come out at various states or various days of the week. And then every episode we posted on our regular stream on Monday, right? I forget today is Monday, right? It's been a long week, man.
Yeah, I know.
But it's been a long month, long year. And we wanted to reemphasize again that our next Patreon only episode, so to speak, is not going to be Patreon only. In fact, we're going to be doing as a live stream, and it'll be posted on our main feed. And that is going to be an analysis of Renly Baratheon, as we talked about last week. So that'll be coming after we do the second part of CATELYN IV, I think, before we jump into Tyrion's 8th chapter in A Clash of Kings. And
that'll be a nice way to wrap up this great discussion of Storm's End, although we still, of course, have Davos 2 ahead of us, which, if anything, is a bigger and better chapter than CATELYN 3 and 4. So strap on your climbing spikes, folks.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be 2 parts at the very least for sure. Demon Blackfire, hi, says, do you think that Roose Bolton has something up his sleeve to use against Stannis we don't know about yet?
Not that we don't know about yet. We saw him do it. He's sending out the Manderleys and the Freys,
right,
in the hopes that they'll, fight Stannis and each other, and that no one who emerges from that mess will be anyone he has to deal with, which is kind of how the North seems to be feeling about Roose and Stannis. Let them fight. That's what I like about the North and Dance, is everyone is playing let them fight, just at a different level, which is like even Big Walder is kind of doing that. So that's a lot of fun. I don't think Roose has. I don't think Roose has an extra move once that falls apart. I think Roose is like already dead at this point. By the time you probably get to the end of A Dance with Dragons, I think Ramsay might already have killed him. So I think he's out of moves by the time we get to Winterfell again.
Yeah, him sending the phrase the Manderleys against Stannis is his move. But his other move is to have the Karstarks already planted in Stannis' side and have Arnulf Karstark.
Good point, of course. I forgot about that. That's already falling apart.
Yeah, so it's like, oh, well, that ended really badly for Roose Bolton. So now Stannis has control of the Dreadfort Maester, and as well as the Karstark men, who he says in the unsampled chapter are likely played no part in what Arnulf and Arnulf's sons wanted to commit the treason against Stannis. So yeah, that's going to definitely going to be something. I think Roose Bolton moves are basically all played out at this point. I think now he is dead or just about to die. Wolfman Zach, our small council member, asks, if you could shadow drone anyone else to Song of Ice and Fire, who would it be?
Well, I mean, I'm not a violent man. I ideally don't want to drone strike anybody. If you force me, I mean, I would take grand personal satisfaction from Littlefinger. I must say, there are a lot of people would escape utter horrors if you do it to Ramsay or Gregor, but Euron for the greater good, or Tywin, I guess. What about you?
I'm with you there. I guess. I mean, I never really think about these violent delights have violent ends, right? I mean, that's the Westworld slogan, Shakespeare slogan first, of course. Littlefinger, obviously. Gregor Clegane.
Just for fun, Littlefinger. You could say Euron and Tywin are kind of more dangerous, maybe, but Littlefinger, ooh, just the look on his face.
It would be glorious. Absolutely glorious. All right. So now, Clint, our secret Blackfire-style conspirator in the small council, asks, now that we're talking about social contracts and Republican governments and whatnot, if you were Westerosi James Madison, what structure would you put in, and who would be the major leaders?
Oh, Lord.
I would love to hear.
Let's reorganize everything around like food banks and go from there. I don't know. James Madison is a lofty title to give me. I'll be more like, how much hay can we possibly bring in over here? Jeff, how would you, if given a powdered wig, proceed?
Well, I think first of all, we would want to establish a constitution of Westeros. Several articles, I would think, probably be good. Separation of powers, being strong. Have a kind of diffuse system of regional power structured around the Lords Paramount, who are of course elected to higher positions of authority, and we have regional lords who are being elected to the House of Westeros. And I wish that I was smart. I know Clint and this is a good spot to talk about this. Clint and Mary have a brand new podcast talking about all of the laws of Westeros and analyzing the legal systems of Westeros. And I am going to turn the question back to you, Clint. You tell me how we are going to actually organize Westeros politically in the wake of all of the terrible things that have happened, and how if you were Westerosi James Madison and if Mary was Alexander Hamilton, how do you establish a Westeros in a post-feudal society?
Everyone gets the talking stick. I'm currently holding the talking stick. Your turn with the talking stick will come next.
Oh, yes. All right. Leo asks, which semi-permanent characters do you think we'll see as whites?
This is always a fun one. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I get the idea behind having the Shaun of the Dead moment where you got to kill the white of the person, but like, I'm having difficulty imagining who that would actually be. Who do you think?
I mean, the Weeper, because fuck that guy. I mean, I guess you would see him as a white. I think who's the Ironborn guy who's the commander over at Eastwatch, who elects John to
Cotter Pike. Yeah, that's
Pike,
a solid choice because he's up with the dead things in the water.
Yeah, he's coming back as a white if we end up seeing ever again. So we'll see. I see a little comment from someone else here. Did Jeff just say libertine sex is awesome? From an Emmett Booth, is that correct?
Yeah. You were like, Oberyn's attitude is much the healthier. I was like, that's interesting.
I think it's healthier than being sad and like fucking because you're sad. Fuck because you're happy, not because you're sad.
Christian is against having sex because you're sad.
Yes.
Isn't that like the 11th commandment?
No, listen. You're thinking. I think you're thinking of the Catholics, which I am not a part of. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. Y'all don't have quite the tortured angle. Good point.
Do you think Barbie will meet any of the Starks? Barbie Dustin? Yeah. Oh, you had brought up a great idea about Barbie and Sansa back in the day, right?
That makes sense to me, especially if Sansa's going to end up in charge of the North in the books. Barbie seems like a logical like mentor, or maybe that's too cuddly, but like kind of transitional figure or someone who paves the way for that. There's got to be a reason all these women in the North and dance get introduced. Barbary, Alice Karstark, Alysanne Mormont, Wyla Manderly. Like they're all there, I think, maybe in part just to set up Sansa's, women's court, the equivalent of Alysanne coming to the North. And Barbie would be a huge part of that because she's not, just a young woman coming into power. She's operated in power for quite some time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Barbary interacting with the Starks would be interesting. I'd be curious to see like whether she retains any of her anger that towards the Starks, towards a son or daughter of Ned Stark. I can't imagine that she would. But I guess we'll have to see. Since again, like we were talking about in our Grand Northern Conspiracy Theory episode, that a lot of her anger, all the people that she's projecting her anger on are gone or dead at this point. And there's only people like Ramsay who are left that are still alive, at least by the end of A Dance of Dragons, to actually be angry with. So we'll see.
Also,
Broken King asks, what's Jane Westerling's endgame? Will she die by Lady Stoneheart? Yeah.
Yeah. Very much so. Come on, I don't mean to be mean, but what else is there?
Yeah.
Not having a kid, and I don't think George has much of an idea of what to do with her about other than be sad about that. Which I don't mean to be glib. I think her show when she shows up at the end of Feast in that Jaime chapter with her mom, that's brutal and emotional and very well done. But yeah, I think that was it.
And I think too, like this is supposed to be the stomach churning moment for us. We saw in what Stoneheart's doing in the Riverlands specifically, in that we saw it briefly with Brienne of Tarth, right? The end of Feast for Crows, where Lady Stoneheart has her hanged along with Podrick Payne. And you're like, that doesn't seem right to me. That seems like the bad thing. Like you should not do this thing, Lady Stoneheart. But when we come to Jane Westerling, she is a complete and total innocent. But Catelyn or Stoneheart they don't know that, right? They think that she's a part of the treasons that brought down Robb Stark, and Stoneheart is incredibly engaged in exacting vengeance on the perpetrators of the Red Wedding. So I can see that being a commentary on George thematically on how vengeance drives the death of innocence, which is something that George has been doing a lot. And I was rereading before we came on air. Re-listening, of course, because I don't read. I was re-listening to the chapter where Rickard Karstark kills the children kills Barton Lannister and Tion Frey in a storm of swords. And that chapter is all about like the consequence of vengeance, how it never like satisfies you, and how it often endangers and kills innocent people, innocent children. And Jane Westerling is an innocent. She played no part in the Red Wedding. She was basically a dupe. I don't know if dupe is the right word. I don't know if Patsy's the right word. What was the right word with Jane Westerling? She was used by her mother and by the Lannisters.
In the Great Game of Thrones.
Pawn. There you go. Pawn. There you go. Perfectly said. Yeah.
And yeah, but Stoneheart doesn't care about that. She's well beyond such things as proportionality or mercy. Like remember Podrick hanging?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is I think this is Stoneheart coming home to roost, and even along with potentially thinking maybe Jane was in on it. I think she might be in the logic of like if Robb hadn't married you, none of this would happen. So I think that might also be what's going on with her.
Mm-hmm. All right. Excuse me. Nickback asks, where do you stand on what the third big what the fuck moment of A Song of Ice and Fire is according to D&D? 1 is the Red Wedding, 2 is Shireen's burning, 3 equals, to me it's Bran becoming king, not killing Jon, not Jon killing Dany. Does not compute. Okay, so the first thing to be aware of is that, quote, we know that two of the things. The first is Shireen's burning. The second thing is actually not the Red Wedding. It is actually Hold the Door. So the third what the fuck moment that D&D talked about back in 20 2017, 2018. I can't remember one of those years in the past 10 years or so, was done in the context of things that had not happened in the books yet or had not been revealed in the books yet, but that would come out in the show that they were going to implement into the narrative of Game of Thrones. So I think the third thing is, I actually think it's likely Bran becoming the king. Although we did talk about this. You don't think it's a what the fuck moment?
Not compared to Jon killing Dany. Not really.
We talked about this, right? When our predictions for, well, like if you go way back to our Patreon episode talking about our predictions for Game of Thrones season 8, where I think we both said that Jon killing Dany was the third what the fuck moment. But I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to.
I mean, Bran becoming the king, it definitely is going to come as, I think, a surprise to a lot of people. A lot of people don't like it, but it's not like the Red Wedding or Shireen's burning. It's not devastating.
Or hold the door, yeah.
Or hold the door. It doesn't pull your heart out, which Jon killing Dany does. And yeah, I think Jon killing Dany has, if anything, more foreshadowing than King Bran.
Yeah.
And I think you can go back through both their chapters and find a lot of setup for that. But yeah, I think that's, yeah, if I had to guess what they're going for. Although, of course, you mentioned Hodor. Like, there's not just 3 of any of these things, really, but the rule of 3 is just really appealing to all of us. So naturally, we all use that pattern.
Mm-hmm. All right, sorry, I'm scrolling here. Clint says he's not a spy. Sorry about that.
So, of course. My not a spy shirt is gathering a lot of questions that are answered by my shirt.
Josh might ask, what house, if any, uses the alchemy? Is that the question? Or uses the alchemist from the Feast for Crows prologue? I'm not entirely sure. If you want to rephrase that question, feel free to comment below. I'm back at 10:07 p.m. when you guys were commenting there. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think any major houses use alchemy that we know of. And the alchemist himself, he's the faceless man. Obviously, that was Jaqen. There is some dispute over who he's working for, though, for sure.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, this is a question I think you're going to love. Guilty Undertaker asks, you've mentioned Michael Shannon as Stannis and Mad Mikkelsen as Euron Greyjoy. Who else do you want to see cast as in a Song of Ice and Fire character?
I mean, those are the big ones, honestly. Who would be near the top of your list?
Ray Stevenson as Victarion Greyjoy, the guy
right. You mentioned
Titus Bullough from I think I've mentioned that before. Shit, what's that guy's name? Riz Ahmed from for that HBO show, but he would be a good Quentin Martell.
Yes, that's an excellent choice. I was thinking of Ben Kingsley as Roderick the Reader the other day. I was like, that would be delightful.
That would be really good.
It wouldn't like look quite right, but like in terms of just like his mannerisms, his tone, how like fussy he would be, or like Patrick Stewart as Roderick the Reader would be wonderful.
Yeah. Am I frozen on your screen, by the way?
No.
Oh, you're frozen on mine.
Huh.
Weird.
Let me one sec. Well, that's trouble.
You have a great expression on your face. I can see for sure. It's a nice smile. Oh, there's part of you.
I switched webcams, but okay, well, just got to stick with that for now, folks.
No worries. Okay, I'll take a few more questions. Sir Frank B asks, what is the first thing Stannis says if and when the trees start talking to him? He's talking about in the outside the Crofters village, yeah.
Grit his teeth and like complain internally, like it's of all gods to talk to him, it's the one he didn't sign up with.
Yeah, I could just see telling the tree to shut up, or being like, I can't believe the birds are talking now, the trees are talking. Like, what did this fucking kingdom come to? Like, what happened between here and what happened when I was a young man? And what happened was that the apocalypse was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Matilda D asks, what do you think Roderick the Reader's endgame is? He seems too smart to get caught up in Euron's mass blood sacrifice.
I think, stay home and not caught up in it. No, I think that's his endgame. Is like, bye everybody. I mean, he's so he's in the Shield Islands, but I don't get any sense that he then went with Euron south. Like, we don't know that for sure, right? That he's in Euron's fleet.
We don't see him in the Forsaken for sure.
So my bet is he didn't go that far. My bet is he because he's not needed for battle.
No.
So my guess is he went back to the Iron Islands, and when Theon and or Asha returns there, that he will be there to help them take power.
I agree. I think it's. I would have loved so. People have asked this question about who would be a new point of view character that you would add into the Winds of Winter. And my selection has been Roderick the Reader. And I would have him be the person who is experiencing the burning of Old Town from Euron, what Euron does in the Winds of Winter. I think just, especially when the Great Library goes up, I think that would be an excellent point of view character to have. But we have Sammo there who loves books. And so he's an excellent person to already do that. I just think that, Roderick would be a good person. But yeah, I think ultimately he goes back and restores one of the Greyjoys to the throne over Euron and leads kind of a second Kingsmoot, so to speak, as being one of the leaders to kind of put Asha, I guess, onto the Seastone chair.
Agreed completely.
There's a good question way up here. SKNC asks, have either of you read the King Killer Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss? If not, I highly recommend it if you have extra time during the quarantine. It's not finished, but I'm sure that won't be an issue.
It's been a while, but yeah, I remember very much enjoying that.
I've only read the first one, The Name of the Wind, and I really enjoyed that. And I have the second book, whose name I forget off the name I forget off the top of my head, but I really enjoyed the first book.
Called? I remember again. Same with you. I remember The Name of the Wind much more distinctly. Again, it's been a bit.
I even know the third book's title is The Doors of Stone, right, or The Door of Stone, or something like that. But it's unreleased. But couldn't tell you what the.
Someone's gonna say it in the chat before I look it up, but I'm just doing this for my own.
I'm sure. All right, ASOF Geek.
Oh, The Wise Man's Fear. Right,
The Wise Man's Fear. Yes, there we go. Which is a good title. Still a good title.
It's fine.
It's probably fine. Why is Doran still hellbent on revenge after the death of Tywin? It seems illogical for a smart man. I understand the Sand Snakes.
Smart people are prone to revenge. Revenge is not a quality of intelligence.
Right.
I would say. I think, smart people and less smart people have equal access to the gnawing feeling inside to deal with the death of your loved ones. I think Doran is smart enough that he should be able to see a lot of the blind spots in what he's doing, and I think that his emotions are getting in the way, which I think that could and does happen to the best of us.
I agree. I think that people in the story and in real life are consumed by vengeance and by these needs to have their emotional needs satiated by acts of violence. I think we look at real world figures of history and why they do certain things. It doesn't matter your IQ as much as the fallen state of man, if you want to take it that way, and what actually drives people to do good or bad things. So
well said.
All right. Alicia Kingston is in the chat. Hi, Alicia. Good to see you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We're getting a lot of great comments. I'm just trying to scroll through. You guys are chatting quite a bit here. So if I'm missing your comments, feel free to paste them again at the bottom of the chat function. We'll get to them. Okay, Micmac asks, if Jon was Ned's trueborn son along with Robb, do you think he and Theon would have been friends growing up?
Nah. Theon and Jon, personality-wise, I think we're never going to get along for the same reason that Renly and Stannis don't get along.
I agree, and plus, no. They're too dissimilar. I do think there'll be a. I do like the scene from season 7 of Game of Thrones where Jon basically tells Theon you're a Stark and you're a Greyjoy at the same time. But to me, that doesn't indicate that they're friends necessarily. I don't think that is going to be something that will animate both of these men going forward.
Yep, agreed totally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Micah asks, was working on my Chance to Die list and saw this free folk, Grig, who mentions wanting to see the Isle of Faces. How would a man that far north know about the Isle of Faces? Is it a cultural memory or does it come from the Children of the Forest?
That's a good question. Children of the Forest is certainly a strong possibility, or it's just that George wanted to have someone mention the Isle of Faces at that particular moment and, was kind of willing to fudge the details. But, people were talking about King Bran in the chat as potentially ruling from the Isle of Faces. So George might be trying to keep those connections in our mind. I could definitely see that.
I like that too. And we know that Osha talks about, because Bran asks her in Bran's fifth chapter, I think it's his fifth chapter, that she has heard the direwolves calling. She has heard of the Children of the Forest, and she doesn't reference, because Bran asks about the others as well, and she doesn't know them. So it's possible that the Children of the Forest are still interacting with mankind in some functions. So a character like Grig could have interacted with the Child of the Forest in that kind of, storytelling could have come down, and he could have heard of the legendary Isle of Faces, so to speak. And that's a cool way that George kind of does storytelling, and that he has oral history impacting how people are thinking about what could potentially be out there somewhere in the distance. It's kind of the same way he does in the World of Ice and Fire, where people in Ashai think that Lannisport and the lands that the Lannisters have, you can plow the land and out comes gold. Whereas Westerosi think of Ashai as completely darkened and things like that, which it seems actually to be that way. But there does seem to be some interesting oral history that goes in telling the story.
Yep, exactly. All those feed in.
All right. So Frank B asks, in fairness to a previous question, what is your favorite Renly crack ship? Loras doesn't count. That's just a regular ship. Oberyn is an easy answer here.
I mean, I guess Brienne to make her happy. Certainly wouldn't make Renly happy, but there are worse fates, I suppose. No, Euron. That would be fun.
That sounds horrifying.
Yeah.
That's why you like it. I get it. I understand. I respect it. I respect it. I don't really have any Renly crack ships, if I'm being honest.
Can't come up with anything?
I'm sorry. I'm just bereft of ideas. Oh,
someone said Renly and John Con in the chat. Suppose I don't know if Renly would be into that. John Con's not his mood. A little too sad. A little too keeping that candle lit.
Yeah, that's true. Someone else, Micah also suggests Renly and Nibble Dick. Okay.
Well, so to speak.
So to speak. Oh my gosh. Oh, that's so good. Eric R. asks, what's with all the Rhaegar hate when he parallels with Stannis so much? Both experience childhood traumas which shape them. Both become consumed with prophecy which shapes them, etc.
Well, I mean, also a lot of people don't like Stannis very much at all.
No.
But I mean, I think Rhaegar is a character purposely shrouded in mystery and ambiguity, and it's difficult to come to accurate conclusions about him. It's always been difficult for me to get around that he just leaves his dad in charge when he rides off with Lyanna. I don't know what he expected to happen unless he literally found out everything that was going to happen step by step from like the Ghost of High Heart or something.
Yeah.
And the callousness regarding Elia is stands out, but again, it's difficult to know exactly how much Rhaegar knew, and so it's difficult to draw exact conclusions. Even if there are a couple things he did where I go like, yeah, you maybe wouldn't have been that good a king anyway, buddy.
Yeah, I don't really have a hatred for Rhaegar Targaryen. I think I feel ambiguous to him, which is I think what George wants to communicate with Rhaegar. I think it would be a certain and definite improvement over Aerys II Targaryen as a king if he had to assume the kingship.
Take a squirrel off the street, they'd be a better king than Mad Aerys. But yeah, definitely true.
I mean, even Ned says that Robert was not so bad as Aerys Targaryen, not so bad at all, and that's saying something because Robert was a really bad king, as we talked about, and we did a Game of Thrones in our Patreon episode about Robert Baratheon. Why is there so much Rhaegar hate? I do think a lot of it comes down to his treatment of Elia Martell. And his treatment of his children as well, and leaving his children in the hands of his father, which is also not great. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's gonna be more to say about Rhaegar come the Winds of Winter. I'm interested to see how some of Rhaegar's backstory is going to be examined and kind of interrogated a bit more come the Winds of Winter, and how that's going to work in terms of our POV structure and what we're actually going to learn about Rhaegar, or whether he'll continue to kind of factor in as a kind of more ambiguous figure even by the end of the story.
Yep, I think we'll probably never be done learning about Rhaegar Targaryen, and a lot of it will just always vanish into the mist.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question for you. Is from a Song of Ice and Fire Geek U. Is George R. R. Martin going to try and humanize Euron and Ramsay before their death? It would be hard.
Well, yeah, no kidding. I mean, humanize in that they didn't just wake up one day going, "Wahaha, I am evil," but not humanize in the sense that now I sympathize. I don't think that's happening for either of those guys. Ramsay, I think we already have it, that he has a huge chip on his shoulder from how his dad, treats him and thinks about him. I think that's Ramsay's humanization. For Euron, I think we get a sense of it in The Forsaken, which is that he's an addict and that he really is just his brain got hollowed out by power and he just can't help it and just needs more. Otherwise, he's just going to start scratching at himself in the corner. So again, it's not exactly making him more sympathetic, but I do think that you understand how a human being got himself into that position.
Yeah, I mean, with Ramsay, George does a really good job of doing this. With Ramsay and Euron, with a character like the Mountain, he ends up putting an interesting backstory into them. As we know from Ramsay, he was a bastard. His mother was raped by Roose Bolton, and Ramsay was denied any love from his father at any point in his story, abandoned until Ramsay's mom came to him at some point before the main story presented Ramsay to her. So he has a big chip on his shoulder, but I think that's the extent of the humanization for him. Euron, I agree, him being an addict is a big part of it as well. I do think, like, too, Euron being a failed disciple of Bloodraven, that great theory that you've been writing on for several years now, is another part of like the kind of humanization of Euron, of what it means when you actually are rejected by the Messiah, or rejected to be the Messiah, so to speak, and what that will do to your psychology and how you might want to like bring that forward. And then with like Gregor Clegane, he has gigantism and has serious headaches and is quaffing milk of the poppy by like, you know, by the pintful, if I remember from A Feast for Crows, or when that was mentioned. So I think that's the humanization that George does for a lot of these really bad characters. But I also think it's really important too to note that George, in humanizing these characters, he's not offering excuses for why they are the way that they are. He's only showing them the backstory of what draws them to that point. I think the great counterexample to these characters is someone like Samwell Tarly, who has been abused by his father for most of his life, was threatened to be murdered by his father unless he took the Night's Watch vows. But he comes north, and I think we talked about this in a Game of Thrones, he comes north to the Wall as a good person, and by the end of A Feast of Crows remains a really good person. So your backstory is only one part of it. What you do in the present, what these characters do in the present, is much more important for whether you are actually going to leave that terrible backstory behind or embrace something new and good for yourself going forward.
Perfect, sir.
Thank you. I think we'll take maybe one or two more questions.
Sure, works for me.
Sign off for the evening. Thank you all guys for all joining us this evening. This was a lot of fun to do this. We had a lot. We still have 88 people still watching, which is really cool. That's really appreciate it.
So happy to have you here.
At 10:30 at night, Freedom Standard Time. So that's awesome. Joe, the magician, says, would Stannis have allowed all the horrible things Cersei fears if he actually took King's Landing? So Cersei mentions rapes, executions, rapes by, not by Stannis, but by his men, and executions, as what would be what Stannis would do on the docket, and of course mounting Tom and Joffrey and Cersei's heads on spikes on the Red Keep. I think the executions are definitely one part of it, for sure. I think that would definitely happen if Stannis had taken King's Landing. The rapes are not interesting, as that's the word I was about to use, but are more ambiguous, because Stannis does, there's that line from A Dance of Dragons where he does have rapists that are people who rape in his army, then gelded. But would he have allowed that in King's Landing? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, he punishes it after the fact.
True.
It still happens. And in King's Landing, unlike the show, Stannis is not on the front line with his men. He's in the back. He's on the other side of the river. He presumably would not be crossing, with George Washington. He's not there on the front line, so he is in no position to stop his men from doing anything. Yes, absolutely, there would be punishment after the fact, and that certainly is better than those who would not do that punishment, I suppose. Although certainly a lot of Stannis' punishments tend to go too far. But yeah, I think Cersei's just describing what would happen when an army sacks a city. I think it's none of all the people in Stannis' army share his beliefs about these things.
I mean, we have people like Clayton Suggs, who is noted in A Dance with Dragons, takes particular pleasure in torturing women, specifically in the Dragonstone dungeon, participating with the torturers in there. So Stannis has a lot of bad apples in his army, but it's not just the bad apples, right? I mean, there's that great point that Jamie brings up in A Storm of Swords about Steelshanks Walton, who is a normal dude, right? Who would go off to war, would do his share of rapes and atrocities during the war itself, and return back and raise a family of squalling children. That's the line that Jamie uses. That, to me, indicates that it's not just about the bad apples. It's about what war does to people when it transforms them and transforms normal-seeming people into being monstrous on the battlefield and beyond the battlefield, especially in a sacked city, which we saw Tywin's army do terrible things at the end of Robert's Rebellion. Part of that was, some of that at least was ordered by Tywin, we think, or at least I think, especially when it comes to Elia. But I think also, too, a lot of it's just the normal practice of warfare and what happens to a sacked city at the end of said warfare. I mean, we know this from history as well, because, Maddie, I think, is in the chat somewhere, but we were talking about the Third Crusade. But at the end of the First Crusade, the Crusaders, the people who were bearing the cross of Jesus Christ, sacked the city of Jerusalem, and if I remember correctly, there's like an accounting of, blood up to the waist of people running through the streets with, women being raped and Muslims and Christians and Jews all being massacred by these alleged Christians. Well, Christians actually, Christians in name. And that's yeah, I think that's a normal practice for a lot of these, and that's yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it would act as a deterrent to a certain extent, but these are soldiers who've just been through wildfire and are running into a city. I don't think the thought process here is super rational necessarily.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. All right, who's going to get the final question? Let's see here. This isn't a question, but Clint says George Washington greater than signed Stannis Baratheon, according to Emmett Booth.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, one still has slaves and everything, but if I was gonna pick one of those two dudes to lead me into battle, it would probably be George Washington. I would be running away from the battle at the nearest opportunity, so I'd be picking which of these men I would betray and cowardly flee. But that man would be George Washington.
All right, final question. I think this is an excellent one to close out on. It comes from Matilda D, who asks, Stannis, good?
Yes and no. It depends on the day, which is what George just said. That's how real people are. Monday you do great things, Tuesday you do terrible things, Wednesday you do great things. And the problem isn't that. The problem is power. The problem when you have authority to inflate your good and bad days to huge extremes.
Yeah. He's a half-rotted onion, right? He's what Davos says about himself at the end of Davos' second chapter in A Clash of Kings. He's not wholly good. He's not wholly bad. He's done bad things. He's done good things, and that's who Stannis is ultimately. Good and bad is something that George likes to leave to the interpretation of the reader, and we'll have endless debates about Stannis Baratheon, whether he's good or bad or anything or nothing at all. And I think that's part of the story of A Song of Ice and Fire for sure.
Yeah, again, it's we as people are really just contradictory beings that are hard to settle, and we have archetypes and religion and stories in part to help us settle that stuff and help sort it out into convenient jars, which isn't really how reality works, but we kind of have to do it to get through life.
Absolutely. And I think that is an excellent point for us to close out this live stream for Clash Kings CATELYN IV and all of the fantastic questions you guys asked us and all of the excellent discussions that I see populating over here. You can't see my screen, but on my side of the screen, I can see all of them. I love all the stuff you guys are bringing up and really appreciate you all tuning in and hope you guys are staying safe and healthy and keep the candle burning, I guess.
Stay safe, everyone, and I hope that your loved ones are doing well, and we're thinking of all you in this moment.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.